There are objects in this world that outlast kings, kingdoms, and even the memory of those who made them. Simple ornaments of gold, carved tools, or weathered machines that once powered entire villages. They might look ordinary at first, but each artifact carries a hidden story, a whisper from the past that tells us how people lived, dreamed, and survived. In this journey, we are not just looking at broken stones or faded relics. We're stepping into the lives of those who left them behind, trying to understand what they valued, what they feared, and what they hoped would be remembered. Gold ear ornaments with granulated animals, Andhra Pradesh, Satavahana dynasty. When we think of ancient Indian jewelry, we often picture heavy necklaces, bangles, and gemstones. But hidden in the collections of early Indian artifacts are pieces that go far beyond mere decoration. They are not just ornaments to be worn, but small masterpieces of storytelling, symbolism, and power. Among them are the gold ear ornaments created in Andhra Pradesh during the Satavahana dynasty, dating back over 2,000 years, between 100 BC and 100 AD. These ornaments are striking not only because of their beauty, but because of their technique. They were made using what is known as the granulation method. This was a highly skilled form of goldsmithing in which tiny granules of gold were fused onto a surface to create intricate patterns, textures, and figures. Imagine a jeweler working without modern tools, carefully placing each small bead of gold to form miniature animals that look alive even after 2 millennia. The animals themselves carry meaning. In Indian traditions, animals often symbolize cosmic powers, virtues, or aspects of the natural world tied to myth and belief. The fact that such small details were given life on ear ornaments tells us that these were not casual accessories. They belonged to people of status, royalty, wealthy merchants, or members of the elite who could commission such skilled artistry. The Satavahana dynasty ruled large parts of central and southern India. They controlled important trade routes that connected inland cities to coastal ports. This was a period when India was deeply connected with the wider world. Trade reached the Roman Empire, Southeast Asia, and even beyond. Roman gold coins have been found in Satavahana territory, suggesting that foreign goods and wealth flowed into India, and Indian crafts in turn traveled far out. The gold used in these ornaments may itself have been imported, melted, and reshaped into art. What makes these ear ornaments fascinating is not only their style but their endurance. Gold does not corrode easily, and so across 2,000 years these objects remain almost as fresh as when they were first worn. If you look closely, you can see the granulated animals, miniature representations that might include lions, elephants, or birds. These creatures were not chosen randomly. Lions represented strength and kingship, elephants were tied to prosperity and royal power, and birds often symbolized freedom or the soul's journey. Wearing these ornaments was more than fashion, it was a statement of identity. They spoke of the wearer's wealth, their alignment with certain symbols of protection, and their place in the social order. In many Indian traditions, jewelry also held ritual significance, believed to ward off evil or attract auspicious energies. Gold, in particular, was seen as a pure metal connected with the sun, permanence, and divinity. One can imagine a Satavahana noblewoman wearing these elaborate ornaments during a ceremonial gathering, their shine catching the light as she moved, the tiny animals reflecting stories of power and cosmic order. These ornaments were not light either. Ancient Indian ear jewelry was often large and heavy, sometimes stretching the earlobe over time. The commitment to wearing them was as much cultural as aesthetic. Archaeologists who study such ornaments are struck by the advanced craftsmanship. Granulation requires precise control of heat. If the jeweler applied too much heat, the entire piece could melt or collapse. If too little, the granules would not fuse properly. The survival of these ornaments tells us that the Satavahana goldsmiths were masters of their craft, achieving techniques that rival anything produced in the ancient Mediterranean or the Middle East. The ornaments also remind us that jewelry in ancient India was not separated from art, religion, or politics. The Satavahana dynasty used imagery of animals, gods, and symbols to reinforce their authority. Artifacts like these, though small, carried the same ideological weight as inscriptions on pillars or carvings on temple walls. They represented a world where beauty, belief, and power merged into a single form. If we think of jewelry today, it is often mass-produced, created quickly, and worn as fashion. But in the ancient world, jewelry like these gold ear ornaments was singular, personal, and sacred. Each piece required weeks of work. Each symbol carried layers of meaning, and each ornament survived because it was valued enough to be buried, preserved, or hidden away until rediscovered by archaeologists. What makes these ornaments especially fascinating is the way they tie India into the larger story of world art. Granulation as a technique is known from the Etruscans, the Greeks, and even ancient Mesopotamians. That the Satavahana artisans used it so effectively raises questions about cultural exchange. Did the technique travel through trade? Or did Indian craftsmen invent their own method independently? Scholars still debate this, but either way, the ornaments stand as proof that India was never isolated. It was always part of a vast web of global craftsmanship and exchange. As you imagine these ornaments, picture their tiny details. Picture the patience of the artisan shaping granules of gold no bigger than grains of sand. Picture the animals slowly forming, alive in miniature. And picture the world in which they were worn, a bustling Satavahana city, with traders arriving from Rome, Persia, and Southeast Asia, with markets filled with textiles, spices, and gemstones, and with nobles displaying their wealth through ornaments like these. The gold ear ornaments of Andhra Pradesh are more than museum pieces. They are whispers from a world that no longer exists, a reminder of human creativity, patience, and the desire to make beauty last across the ages. The votive figurines of the temple mayor. Beneath the bustling heart of modern Mexico City lies the shadow of an empire that once commanded great power and reverence, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. In the remains of its sacred temple mayor, archaeologists made a discovery that continues to intrigue historians and anthropologists alike: a hidden stone chest filled with votive figurines. At first glance, they appeared to be part of the Aztec ritual offerings that often accompanied such temples, but closer study revealed something far more unusual. Many of these figurines were much older than the Aztecs themselves, predating the construction of the temple mayor by more than 1,000 years. The figurines belonged to the Mezcala culture, a civilization that flourished in the region of Guerrero from around 700 BC to 650 AD. These were not local to the Aztec heartland. They had been created centuries earlier, far away from Tenochtitlan, and yet they somehow found their way into the sacred heart of the Aztec Empire. Their journey, from the hands of their original makers to the offering boxes of the Aztec capital, remains one of the more curious mysteries of pre-Columbian archaeology. Each figurine is carved from greenstone, a material that held profound spiritual value for many Mesoamerican peoples. Greenstone, often resembling jade, was seen as the very essence of life, fertility, and renewal. The Mezcala crafted these small statues with geometric precision, faces, limbs, and torsos simplified into striking, abstract forms. They were neither portraits nor decorative toys, but symbolic beings intended to embody forces beyond the visible world. Some depict standing humans with sharp angular features, others appear as masks or miniature idols meant to represent deities or spirits. When the Aztecs uncovered these relics, they seemed to recognize their ancient power. To the Aztec mind, these were not just old trinkets or artifacts from a long-forgotten people. They were sacred relics of a mysterious past, imbued with an otherworldly energy. The Aztecs had a deep respect for objects they considered titur, meaning infused with divinity. Anything ancient, mysterious, and made with evident reverence naturally fell into this category. So rather than discarding or ignoring these figurines, the Aztecs carefully collected them and placed them in their most important temple as offerings to their gods. This raises fascinating questions. How did the Aztecs come into possession of figurines that were already 1,000 years old by their time? Were these items traded over generations, passed down as heirlooms among local communities, until finally reaching the Aztecs? Or did the Aztecs deliberately seek them out, scavenging ruins of older cultures to retrieve relics they saw as potent symbols of the divine? The idea that the Aztecs were collectors of antiquities is not as strange as it may sound. Archaeological evidence suggests they often incorporated objects from earlier civilizations into their religious practices. For them, older objects carried immense weight. The deeper their past, the stronger their connection to sacred origins. To hold a figurine made hundreds of years ago was to hold a direct link to ancient gods and ancestral powers. The discovery of these figurines in the temple mayor gives us a window into how ancient civilizations viewed time and heritage. Unlike our modern approach, which often categorizes artifacts by era and culture, the Aztecs did not see a sharp division between past and present. For them, time was cyclical. The gods who shaped the world in the distant past were still active, and ancient relics were living reminders of that eternal cycle. Among the hundreds of offerings found beneath the temple mayor, shells from distant seas, carved obsidian knives, the remains of sacrificed animals, these figurines stand out because they clearly did not belong to the Aztec world. They were already ancient, already sacred by virtue of their age. By placing them within their temple, the Aztecs gave them a second life, embedding them into their own religious framework. The Mezcala culture itself is shrouded in mystery. Much of what we know about them comes from these small stone figurines. They left behind no great written records, no vast monumental cities like the Maya or the Aztecs. Their legacy survives primarily in their art, these geometric forms that seem at once simple and deeply symbolic. That the Aztecs found such meaning in them reminds us of the enduring power of these small creations. What makes this discovery even more intriguing is the way it reveals a continuity across centuries. Civilizations rise and fall, temples are built and destroyed, yet objects survive, carrying fragments of meaning across time. The votive figurines of the Mezcala were not just artifacts buried in the earth. To the Aztecs, they were active agents of the sacred, worthy of reverence in one of the grandest temples of their empire. Today, as we study them in museums and archaeological reports, we cannot help but reflect on how meaning shifts with time. To the Mezcala, these figurines may have been offerings to local spirits or ancestors. To the Aztecs, they became relics of the divine past, infused with sacred power. To us, they are archaeological treasures that reveal the layered complexity of Mesoamerican history. It is a reminder that history is never a straight line. The past lives on in unexpected ways, carried forward in the hands of those who come after. The figurines of the Temple Mayor show us how one culture can preserve the memory of another, even long after that culture has vanished. They are bridges across centuries, testaments to how humans, no matter the era, seek meaning in what came before. And as they rested in the sacred heart of Tenochtitlan, beneath layers of stone and ritual, they embodied the silent conversation between past and present, a dialogue still unfolding today, as archaeologists uncover the mysteries they left behind. The 2,000-year-old Roman dagger. Imagine standing on a quiet German hillside. The wind brushes past the grass, carrying with it the faint echoes of history. Beneath your feet, hidden in the soil for almost 2,000 years, lies a weapon once carried by a Roman soldier. Not an ordinary weapon, but a dagger so richly decorated, so carefully crafted, that it tells us as much about the culture that made it as it does about the wars it may have seen. This dagger, discovered in 2019, was unlike anything archaeologists expected to find in that place. It was not just a soldier's sidearm, it was a work of art. Its handle and sheath layered in silver, its surface decorated with red enamel, shining even after centuries underground. Yet when it was first pulled from the soil, it was hardly recognizable. Corroded, encrusted with rust and dirt, it looked more like a lump of stone than a relic. What followed was a journey of patience and precision, 9 months of painstaking restoration, layer by layer, until the dagger emerged in all its detail, almost as it must have looked to its original owner. The dagger was found near Haltern in Germany, at the site of an ancient Roman military camp. This camp dates to the 1st century AD, a time when Rome was trying to push its empire deeper into Germanic territory. These campaigns were dangerous. Soldiers stationed here were far from the comforts of Rome, constantly facing threats from local tribes who resisted Roman control. For a soldier in this environment, a dagger wasn't just a tool or a weapon, it was a symbol of status and identity. Most Roman daggers, known as pugianas, were fairly simple in design. They were functional, sturdy, and meant for use in close combat. But the dagger found in Haltern was different. The ornate silverwork and bright red enamel show us that this was more than just a weapon. It was likely ceremonial, perhaps belonging to an officer or someone of higher rank. The artistry reflects Roman values, where weapons were not only tools of war, but also expressions of power and prestige. The restoration process itself was a remarkable story. For 9 months, conservators worked with extraordinary care, cleaning away corrosion without damaging the delicate metal beneath. Using microscopes, fine tools, and chemical treatments, they slowly revealed the intricate patterns on the sheath and handle. The red enamel, still vivid after nearly 2 millennia, was a surprise, showing how Roman artisans were masters at blending utility with beauty. To imagine this dagger in its prime is to picture a Roman soldier standing in full gear, armor gleaming, shield ready, and at his side this dagger, both practical and ornamental. It may never have been used in combat. It might have been more for display, for ceremony, or as a marker of distinction. But even so, it carried weight. It represented the reach of Roman craftsmanship and the culture of honor that permeated the legions. The discovery raises questions about the soldier who owned it. Who was he? Was he a commander respected by his men? Was the dagger gifted to him for service, or was it something he acquired as a personal treasure? We cannot know for certain, but the very survival of this dagger across centuries hints at the significance it once held. Roman weapons often reveal the blending of cultures within the empire. The materials and techniques used, silver layering, enamel decoration, show both Roman and local influences. Germany, at that time, was a frontier, where Rome's traditions met the artistry of conquered and allied peoples. This dagger reflects that intersection, Roman in form, yet adorned in a way that may have incorporated local styles. For archaeologists, finds like this dagger are more than isolated objects. They are pieces of a puzzle. Around the dagger, other artifacts were found: spearheads, tools, fragments of armor. Together, they help paint a picture of life in a Roman military camp. Soldiers lived, trained, fought, and died far from their homes, carrying with them objects that gave them identity and pride. The symbolism of a dagger runs deep. To the Romans, it was not only a secondary weapon, but also a constant companion. Soldiers carried them everywhere, even off the battlefield. In some cases, daggers were used in rituals, offerings, or even burials. The decorated nature of this piece suggests it may have been intended for more than survival. It could have been a badge of office, a ceremonial object, or even a prized possession passed down through generations. The dagger also reminds us of the fragility of history. When it was first unearthed, it could have easily been dismissed as scrap metal. Without careful excavation and expert restoration, its beauty might never have been revealed. Instead, it now stands as one of the most spectacular Roman daggers ever discovered in northern Europe. Its discovery also forces us to reconsider what life was like on the Roman frontier. Soldiers weren't just rough warriors in muddy camps. They brought with them artistry, culture, and craftsmanship. Even in hostile environments, they carried symbols of the empire's wealth and sophistication. This dagger shows us that Rome wasn't simply projecting military power. It was projecting identity, blending war with art. The restored dagger now sits on display, preserved in a way that allows us to see both its history and its artistry. Visitors who stand before it today see not only an object of war, but also a story of a soldier, a culture, and the empire that stretched across continents. As you think about this dagger, picture its journey, forged nearly 2,000 years ago, held by Roman hands, carried into foreign lands, buried beneath soil and time, and then uncovered, restored, and admired once more. It connects us to a world that feels distant, yet not so different from our own. A world where objects carried meaning, where craftsmanship mattered, and where even in war, beauty was never forgotten. The Roman dagger discovered in 2019 is more than an archaeological find. It is a reminder of the endurance of human creativity, the persistence of memory, and the stories that lie hidden beneath our feet, waiting for us to uncover them. The ancient windmills of Nashtifan. In a remote corner of northeastern Iran, there is a village that has held on to a remarkable piece of technology for nearly 1,000 years. The small settlement of Nashtifan, perched along the windswept plains of Khorasan, is home to some of the oldest functioning windmills in the world. Unlike the towering stone windmills of Europe that most people imagine, these structures are built from mud, clay, and wood, standing like ancient sentinels against the desert sky. What makes them extraordinary is not only their age, but the fact that many of them are still capable of grinding grain into flour, using the same ingenious design that their builders relied on around a millennium ago. To understand why these windmills are so important, you first have to imagine the environment in which they were built. The region of Nashtifan is known for its strong, persistent winds. In fact, the very name Nashtifan comes from two Persian words, meaning storm's sting, a reference to the fierce gusts that sweep across the landscape. For the people who lived here, these winds were both a challenge and a resource. Too strong for delicate agriculture, too persistent to ignore, the winds could easily strip the land of moisture and topsoil. But instead of seeing them only as a destructive force, the villagers found a way to harness them, turning the very power of the wind into a source of life and sustenance. The windmills of Nashtifan are thought to date back to around 1,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. Scholars often place their construction in the period of the early Islamic Golden Age, when advances in engineering, science, and technology were spreading across the Middle East and beyond. But some believe the idea may have even deeper roots, tied to pre-Islamic Persia, where early forms of wind-powered technology were experimented with to help people survive in harsh desert conditions. Unlike the European post mills or tower mills, the design in Nashtifan is unique to the region. The windmills are vertical-axis windmills, meaning that the central shaft turns upright rather than horizontally. Large wooden blades, arranged like paddles, are mounted on the shaft and covered with bundles of reed matting. When the strong desert winds blow, the force catches these mats and pushes the shaft into motion. The turning shaft is connected to a series of simple gears and millstones inside the structure, which then crush grain into flour. It is a system that is both simple and highly effective, perfectly adapted to the environment in which it exists. One of the most remarkable things about these windmills is how they are built. Instead of stone or heavy timber, which is scarce in the region, the builders relied on what was available: mud, clay, straw, and local wood. The result is a structure that blends into the desert landscape, almost as if it grew from the earth itself. Yet despite being made from such humble materials, these windmills have stood for centuries, repaired and maintained generation after generation. Their survival is a testament not only to the ingenuity of their builders, but also to the dedication of the communities that have relied on them for survival. For much of history, the sound of grinding stones turning inside these windmills would have been a familiar part of life in Nashtifan. Villagers would bring their harvests of wheat, barley, or other grains to be milled into flour, the essential ingredient for bread, which has always been the staple food in this part of the world. The windmills were not simply machines, they were part of the heartbeat of the community, ensuring that families had enough to eat, that traditions of bread baking could continue, and that people could survive in an otherwise harsh landscape. It is also important to note that these windmills predate the famous European windmills by centuries. While most people in the West think of windmills as a medieval European invention, the truth is that the idea of harnessing wind power for milling grain began in places like Persia. The Nashtafan windmills stand as living proof of this fact, showing that ancient engineers in the Islamic world had developed solutions to problems of food production long before such designs appeared elsewhere. This has led historians to argue that the technology of windmills may have traveled westward over time, eventually inspiring later designs in Europe. Today, the windmills of Nashtafan are recognized by UNESCO as part of the world's cultural heritage, though they remain relatively unknown to the wider public. Visitors who travel to the region can see them still standing on the edge of the village, their weathered frames rising against the desert sky. Some of them still turn with the winds, creaking and groaning as they did centuries ago. The sight is both haunting and beautiful, a reminder that human beings have always found ways to adapt to nature and to transform even the most unforgiving forces into tools for survival. There is also a deeper cultural significance to these windmills. They symbolize the connection between people and their environment, the idea that human survival depends not on overpowering nature, but on working with it. In Nashtafan, the villagers did not try to block the winds or escape them. Instead, they embraced them, finding a way to turn the destructive power of storms into a steady supply of food. This philosophy of adaptation and balance has deep roots in Persian culture and continues to resonate even today. Unfortunately, like many ancient technologies, the Nashtafan windmills are now in danger. As modern flour mills and factories have replaced traditional methods, fewer villagers rely on the old windmills, and their maintenance has become more difficult. The skills needed to repair and operate them are fading, passed down to fewer and fewer people. Without active preservation, many of these structures could eventually collapse, leaving behind only ruins of what was once a vibrant working system. Still, efforts are being made to protect and restore them. Preservationists argue that these windmills are not just relics of the past, but valuable lessons for the future. In an age where renewable energy and sustainable living are becoming more urgent, the Nashtafan windmills offer a powerful reminder of how simple, natural forces can sustain human life. They stand as an ancient model of green technology, proof that harnessing the wind is not a modern innovation, but an old tradition with deep roots in human history. When you think about it, there is something almost poetic about these windmills. For nearly 1,000 years they have stood in the desert, their wooden blades catching the same winds that once battered ancient caravans traveling along the Silk Road. They have watched empires rise and fall, seen generations come and go, and yet they continue to creak and groan with the shifting air. They are not monuments built to impress or to glorify rulers. They are tools of survival, humble yet enduring, and in their simplicity, they hold a kind of beauty that modern machines rarely capture. Standing before them today, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the grinding of stone against stone, the footsteps of villagers carrying sacks of grain, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. These are the memories embedded in the walls of the windmills, memories of a community that found a way to thrive in the desert by listening to the wind. As the sun sets over Nashtafan, the silhouettes of the windmills cast long shadows across the desert floor. They stand as guardians of history, reminders of a time when survival depended on ingenuity, and when every gust of wind carried with it the promise of life. Whether or not they continue to turn in the centuries to come, their story endures. A story of adaptation, resilience, and the remarkable human ability to shape the forces of nature into something that sustains us. Mr. Tinkler's rheumatic potato. There are many stories in history that blur the line between fact and folklore, and sometimes they are so odd that they seem almost impossible to categorize. One such account is that of Mr. Tinkler's so-called rheumatic potato, a peculiar tale from the 19th century that circulated in local newspapers, memoirs, and word of mouth, eventually becoming one of those odd curiosities that historians struggle to fully verify, yet cannot entirely dismiss. The story begins with a man named Mr. Tinkler, who was said to have suffered from chronic rheumatism, a painful and often debilitating condition that affected his joints, causing stiffness, swelling, and constant discomfort. At a time when modern medicine was still in its infancy, and doctors often prescribed remedies that today would seem outdated or even bizarre, Mr. Tinkler became the subject of a strange experiment that involved nothing more than a potato, yet one that reportedly grew into a legendary oddity that people would talk about for decades afterward. According to the earliest records of this tale, Mr. Tinkler, a man of modest means living somewhere in the English countryside, had been bedridden for weeks due to his painful rheumatic condition. He had tried various ointments, hot compresses, and even local herbal remedies, none of which seemed to provide lasting relief. His neighbors, however, insisted that he try an old folk cure that had been whispered about in villages for generations, carrying a raw potato in one's pocket. The belief was simple yet peculiar. The potato was thought to somehow draw out the disease, or absorb the pain like a sponge pulling moisture from the air. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but at the time such practices were common and deeply rooted in rural tradition. Potatoes, onions, and other root vegetables were often believed to possess hidden powers, especially when kept close to the body. Reluctant at first but desperate for relief, Mr. Tinkler agreed to try the remedy. He placed a raw potato in his coat pocket and carried it everywhere he went, though in truth he could not walk far because of his swollen joints. Days turned into weeks, and whether by coincidence, natural improvement, or the power of belief, Mr. Tinkler's pain reportedly began to lessen. His neighbors noticed that he was moving more easily, his spirits were lifting, and the grimace of constant pain on his face was softening. The story might have ended there, as one more anecdote of placebo and superstition, were it not for the extraordinary detail that followed. For when Mr. Tinkler finally removed the potato after weeks of carrying it, the villagers claimed it had transformed into something remarkable. Instead of the firm, smooth skin of a normal potato, this one had grown knobby, twisted, and oddly shaped. Some said it looked like a swollen human joint. Others described it as gnarled and discolored, almost as if it had absorbed Mr. Tinkler's rheumatism into its very flesh. The potato became an object of fascination, passed around the village, and inspected by curious eyes. Some declared it proof that the folk cure worked, while others dismissed it as nothing more than a coincidence of rot and natural deformity. But in that moment the potato was elevated from a simple food item to a relic of mystery and healing, forever remembered as the rheumatic potato. Newspapers of the time occasionally reported on such curiosities, often blending fact with exaggeration to amuse their readers. One such clipping described how Mr. Tinkler's potato became so famous that people traveled from neighboring towns to see it. They marveled at how it was shriveled in places yet bulging in others. Almost like it bore the memory of his suffering, it was preserved, so the story goes, on a shelf in his cottage, where visitors would come to view it like one might visit a museum of oddities. To his neighbors, it was a miracle, or at least a charming confirmation of their old traditions. To skeptics, it was a prime example of human imagination shaping reality, turning an ordinary vegetable into a supernatural token. What makes the story even more curious is how it persisted long after Mr. Tinkler's death. Later writers in the early 20th century retold the tale, sometimes adding details, sometimes stripping it down to the core claim that a potato had absorbed a man's rheumatism. These retellings turned it into part of the larger tapestry of folk medicine, where superstition, belief, and coincidence often intertwined. Similar tales exist of potatoes being used to treat warts, fevers, and even toothaches, always with the same idea that the potato somehow took the ailment into itself. And so, Mr. Tinkler's story was not alone, but it was perhaps the most vividly remembered because of the strange physical appearance of his potato and the way people described it as though it carried the scars of his illness. Now, when we step back and examine this with modern knowledge, it is easy to dismiss the entire matter as either fabrication or exaggeration. Rheumatism does not transfer into vegetables, and there is no scientific mechanism by which a potato could absorb human pain. What likely happened was a mixture of natural recovery, the placebo effect, and the natural decay of the potato over time. Potatoes, when carried in a pocket or exposed to moisture, will often sprout, shrink, and become misshapen. To a community eager to see patterns and meaning, the odd shape of the potato may have appeared as proof of its supposed powers. But just because it is explainable today, does not mean it was meaningless then. For people of Mr. Tinkler's time, the rheumatic potato was not simply a vegetable, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the absence of modern medicine, there were ways to fight suffering, even if only in the mind. What is also worth noting is how stories like this spread and lingered. The 19th century was full of such accounts, often shared in local gazettes, traveling shows, and collections of curiosities. The rheumatic potato sat comfortably alongside tales of healing amulets, magical stones, and sacred relics, all of which carried the same underlying truth, that belief itself could be powerful. Whether the potato truly helped Mr. Tinkler or not, the improvement he felt was real to him, and that was enough to sustain the legend. Even today, in the age of advanced science and evidence-based medicine, people turn to folk remedies, natural cures, and symbolic tokens in search of relief. The story of Mr. Tinkler is not just about one man and his potato, it is about the human need to find meaning in suffering, and the lengths to which we will go to believe in something that offers even the faintest hope. In the end, Mr. Tinkler's rheumatic potato remains one of those strange curiosities that hover between reality and myth. Perhaps it was nothing more than a rotting vegetable misinterpreted by eager eyes. Perhaps it was a moment of placebo-induced healing, captured in the imagination of a community hungry for wonders. Or perhaps, in a way that cannot be measured by science, it truly did become a vessel for his pain, a living metaphor carved into the humble flesh of a potato. Whatever the truth, the tale continues to fascinate, because it reminds us how even the most ordinary objects, a stone, a root, or in this case a potato, can become extraordinary when wrapped in the fabric of human belief. And so Mr. Tinkler's name is remembered not for wealth, war, or invention, but for a single misshapen tuber that carried the weight of his suffering and the imagination of his community. Trawlers waiting for their crews. The painting known as Trawlers Waiting for Their Crews may at first seem like a simple maritime scene, a cluster of boats resting in calm water, tethered to the shore while the men who will guide them out to sea linger somewhere beyond the frame. But when you look more deeply into both the subject and the painter who captured it, the work transforms into something far richer, more layered, and more representative of a moment in history when small fishing villages along the coast of northern England carried a cultural weight that was not only about sustenance and survival but about art, about identity, and about the slow yet steady collision between tradition and the modern world. The painter Thomas William Dade was himself a member of the Staith Group, a loosely organized but deeply influential art colony based in the fishing village of Staiths in North Yorkshire. And when we start from that fact, we immediately recognize that this canvas is not just an attempt to render an ordinary harbor, but part of a much larger movement in British art, where painters and sketchers gathered in places far from London, far from the noise of industrial centers, in order to capture what they believed were vanishing ways of life, the lived realities of people who still moved to the rhythm of the tides rather than the rhythm of factory whistles. To Dade, who had studied at Scarborough School of Art in the years 1885 to 1886, was not a household name like Turner or Constable, but his participation in this colony of artists marks him as part of a cultural phenomenon where painters were increasingly turning to the coast, to working-class communities, to fishermen and their families, because these subjects carried a kind of honesty and dignity that high society portraits could not convey. When you stand before trawlers waiting for their crews, you are not being asked to admire the grandeur of an aristocrat's estate or the perfection of a royal commission. You are instead invited into the stillness of a harbor, a liminal moment where the trawlers sit almost silently in the water, their sails lowered, their ropes slack, and yet we know with certainty that this quiet will soon be broken by footsteps, by voices, by the gathering of men who will row out or sail out into the dangerous waters of the North Sea. The painting captures that pause between labor and action, and it is in that pause where we find the real humanity of the work. The Staith Group, of which Dade was a part, was itself inspired by the broader European trend of artist colonies, where painters, often trained in urban academies, would travel to remote locations in search of authenticity. Staith was ideal for this because it was geographically striking, a small village, perched against steep cliffs, with narrow winding streets, rough cottages, and a harbor that was often crowded with fishing boats. The artists who gathered there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were drawn to its atmosphere, its light, and above all, its people. They believed that in Staiths they could find something real, something untainted by the modern world that was rapidly encroaching upon Britain through railroads, industry, and expanding cities. In this context, Dade's Trawlers Waiting for Their Crews is not merely a picturesque study, it is an ethnographic document, a visual archive of a way of life that the artists believed needed to be preserved on canvas before it disappeared. If you linger on the details, you start to notice how the composition itself conveys this sense of waiting. The boats are not depicted at sea, crashing against waves or battling storms. They are quiet, patient, tethered. The ropes that bind them to the shore suggest both security and restriction, as if the vessels themselves long to be released but must remain until the hands that guide them arrive. The water is still, reflective, suggesting a moment early in the morning or late in the evening when the world seems to hold its breath. And then there is the unseen presence of the crews. They are not in the painting, but their absence is precisely what gives the image its tension, because we know that trawlers do not wait forever, and that at any moment the canvas could spring to life with figures hauling nets, loading gear, or preparing to set out into waters where their livelihoods and sometimes their lives would be at stake. When you think about Dade himself, a man who studied in Scarborough before joining this coastal colony, you realize that his choice of subject matter reflects not only an artistic decision, but a social one. Artists like Dade were essentially aligning themselves with ordinary people, saying that their lives and labor were worthy of attention, of being immortalized in oil paint. This was a shift from earlier traditions where art was commissioned by elites to glorify themselves. Instead, the Staiths Group was quietly revolutionary in suggesting that the trawler, the fisherman, the village itself could be subjects of dignity, beauty, and permanence. The painting also reflects the broader cultural changes of its time. By the late 19th century, fishing was not simply a timeless profession. It was under pressure from industrialization, from mechanized trawlers, from the expansion of railways that could carry fish inland faster than ever before. Traditional fishing villages like Staith's were being drawn into a larger economic web, and the old rhythms of life were shifting. In this sense, Trawlers Waiting for Their Crews is tinged with nostalgia, whether Dade intended it or not. It captures a moment of continuity, of boats tied to their moorings in a village where life had changed little for centuries. But it was painted during a period when everyone knew such moments would not last forever. The very act of painting it was an acknowledgement that time was moving, and that the village, the trawlers, the crews, and the life they represented were already becoming part of history. To imagine standing in front of the painting in the quiet of a gallery is to experience something almost meditative. You see the boats, you see the water, you imagine the cliffs rising behind the harbor, and you start to think about the men who lived their lives in rhythm with these vessels. Their mornings began before dawn, their days stretched into uncertain seas, and their evenings ended only when the boats returned heavy with catch, or light with loss. The painting does not show this hardship directly, but it is present in the silence, in the way the trawlers sit like patient animals waiting for their masters, in the way the water reflects the stillness before struggle. What makes Trawlers Waiting for Their Crews such a powerful chapter in both art history and cultural history is precisely this layering of meaning. On the surface, it is an attractive scene of maritime life, but beneath that surface, it is an artifact of an art colony seeking authenticity. It is a reflection of social change. It is a portrait of waiting and absence, and it is a memorial to a way of life that even as Dade painted it was already slipping away. The Staith group may not be as famous as other art movements, but their commitment to capturing the ordinary lives of fishing communities has left us with images that resonate far beyond their immediate context. They remind us that history is not only written in great battles or royal decrees, but also in the quiet moments of boats tied to a harbor wall, waiting for the men who will soon set them free. And so, as you listen and imagine this chapter unfold, let yourself drift into that harbor of Staith's. Let your mind walk along the cobbled streets down to the water's edge. Let your eyes rest on the wooden hulls and folded sails, and let your imagination fill in the absent figures who will, in just a few moments, bring the scene to life. For now, though, hold on to the stillness, the pause, the suspension of time that Dade captured, because it is in that silence that we find not only the essence of the painting, but the essence of an entire way of life, waiting quietly in the frame of memory. Jezebel and Ahab. When we step into the quiet, echoing halls of the Royal Academy in the year 1863, one canvas stood out, not only for its scale, but for the weight of its story. The painting, titled Jezebel and Ahab, transported viewers back to one of the most charged moments in the Old Testament. It was not simply a picture of two biblical figures. It was a reminder of ambition, corruption, confrontation, and divine justice, translated through brush and pigment into a scene Victorians could stand before and contemplate. The story, of course, originates in the Book of Kings. King Ahab, ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, is often remembered as a man easily swayed, and his queen Jezebel has become a lasting symbol of manipulation and ruthlessness. In Scripture, Jezebel is portrayed as the force behind much of Ahab's darker choices, urging him to abandon the worship of Yahweh in favor of Baal, encouraging plots that would consolidate his power, and silencing those who stood in her way. The painting focuses on one pivotal encounter. The prophet Elijah, gaunt and stern, confronts the royal couple after Ahab seizes Naboth's vineyard, an act that defied law, morality, and faith. In the narrative, Elijah declares that divine judgment is inevitable. For Victorian audiences, steeped in biblical literacy, this moment carried immense gravity. It was a cautionary tale about pride, greed, and the abuse of authority, themes that resonated strongly in a century marked by industrial growth, social change, and moral debates. But what makes this painting especially powerful is the way the artist framed the scene. Jezebel is not shown as a flat villainess. Her posture, her gaze, the colors around her, each detail invites the viewer to consider her humanity, as well as her defiance. Ahab, in turn, is often depicted with an expression torn between guilt and weakness, as though he is aware of his failures but unwilling to resist Jezebel's influence. The prophet Elijah, on the other hand, stands as an unwavering figure of moral clarity, a sharp contrast to the ornate setting and royal figures before him. Victorian audiences were not passive observers, they brought their own concerns into the gallery. In an age when the British Empire held immense power and questions about morality and governance were ever present, the painting's message seemed especially pointed. Was it merely a biblical story, or was it also a mirror held up to leaders of the day? Some critics suggested that the work reminded its audience of the dangers of political corruption, unchecked authority, and the silencing of truth-tellers. From an artistic standpoint, the painter used stark contrasts: light against shadow, prophet against royalty, truth against deception. Jezebel is often painted with luxurious fabrics, vibrant colors, and a sense of command. In contrast, Elijah is clothed simply, often in earth tones, almost blending with the background, yet standing taller in moral presence. That tension, the richness of worldly power against the stripped-down certainty of faith, gave the painting its dramatic impact. The choice of subject itself was telling. Mid-19th century Britain was fascinated by biblical narratives in art. They were not only religious, but educational, moral, and cultural. To paint Jezebel and Ahab was to remind the public of stories they had grown up hearing in sermons, classrooms, and family readings. Yet here, in the Royal Academy, those lessons were given color, shape, and emotion in a way words alone could not convey. As viewers lingered in front of the work, they were invited into reflection. Was Jezebel truly the embodiment of evil, or was she a complex character, ambitious, determined, and unwilling to yield in a male-dominated world? Was Ahab a villain, or merely a weak man caught between his desires and his responsibilities? And what of Elijah? Did his unwavering moral certainty make him admirable, or distant and unyielding? These questions added depth, ensuring that the painting was not just illustration but conversation. The reception at the time was mixed but intense. Some praised the painter for bravery in tackling such a weighty subject. Others criticized the depiction of Jezebel as too sympathetic, too compelling, as though the audience might leave admiring her strength rather than condemning her cruelty. But in either case, the painting achieved something rare. It made people talk, think, and return to the story with fresh eyes. Looking back now, more than a century and a half later, the canvas holds even greater fascination. Art historians examine it as part of the broader Victorian trend of moral storytelling through art. Theologians see in it an interpretation of scripture that reflects the anxieties of 19th century Britain. And casual viewers, standing before it in a museum, can still feel the tension in the air between Elijah and the royal pair. The painting also asks us to consider the enduring power of images. A written account can tell us of Jezebel's pride and Ahab's weakness, but a painting frozen in a single dramatic moment can capture emotion in a way that lingers. You see the prophet's sternness, the queen's pride, the king's unease. It allows you to step inside the moment and sense the drama as if you were in the royal court yourself. In that sense, Jezebel and Ahab is more than just a religious painting. It is a bridge across centuries, carrying with it questions about morality, power, human frailty, and the role of conscience. It reminds us that stories told thousands of years ago can still find new expression in the modern world, through the brush of an artist who sought not merely to illustrate, but to challenge, provoke, and inspire. And so, as the quiet halls of the Royal Academy echo in memory, the painting remains, still speaking, still confronting, still asking us to look closer at the choices of leaders, the influence of partners, and the courage of those who dare to speak truth to power. Candle and matches. At first glance, a small stub of wax and two burned-out matches might appear so ordinary that one could almost dismiss them without a second thought. The kind of objects you might find forgotten in the corner of an old drawer, or left behind after a long night. But when placed in the context of history, survival, and the daily struggles of ordinary people, even these humble items begin to reveal a story that is larger than themselves, a story that reaches back into the very fabric of how humans endured the darkness, how they carried on through hardship, and how they found a way to create warmth, light, and a fragile sense of security in moments when the world around them was uncertain and unforgiving. The candle stub, no longer capable of offering more than a few minutes of light, and the two matches, already spent and blackened from their brief burst of flame, are remnants that may seem almost laughably insignificant compared to glittering jewelry, towering monuments, or lavish paintings that fill museums. Yet they remind us of a truth that is often overlooked, that history is not only made up of grand events and royal figures, but also of the quiet persistence of ordinary lives, and the tools that enabled those lives to continue. Tools so small they could fit in the palm of a hand, but so vital they became lifelines in times of darkness. Imagine the world before the modern convenience of electricity, before the soft glow of lamps at the flick of a switch, before even the reliable spark of safety matches mass-produced and readily available in shops, and you begin to understand just how precious a single candle or a single match could be to someone who needed to study into the night, to someone who had to work in dim, cramped spaces, or to someone simply trying to keep fear at bay when the shadows closed in around them. This little box, now preserved behind museum glass, might once have been carried by a soldier in the trenches, where every small comfort was treasured, or perhaps it belonged to a family displaced during war, where the faint glow of that candle could transform a cold, unfamiliar shelter into a place that felt momentarily like home. Or maybe it was a sailor's kit, tucked into a pocket during long voyages across dangerous seas, offering not just light but the potential to kindle fire, heat food, or signal for rescue, if stranded in some desolate corner of the world. The story of fire is, in truth, the story of human civilization itself, because the ability to create and control flame marked the first great turning point for our species, allowing us to step out of the limitations imposed by nature, to cook food that nourished our bodies in new ways, to gather together around the glow of embers in the night, building communities and traditions, and to drive away predators and fears that lurked in the dark. And so even the tiniest candle stub carries within it echoes of this monumental leap forward, reminding us that survival was not just about strength or weapons, but about knowledge, patience, and the will to preserve light against overwhelming darkness. When a museum chooses to keep something as unassuming as this box of candle and matches, it is not because the object itself dazzles the eye, but because it forces us to look past appearances and consider the weight of context, the questions it raises about who used it, when, and why, and the realization that in the right circumstances, such a simple item could mean the difference between despair and endurance, between being swallowed by the night and holding on to a fragile thread of hope. If you picture a child clutching this candle during an air raid in World War II, huddled in a shelter underground while bombs thundered overhead, the flame would have been more than just light, it would have been reassurance, a symbol that life still burned even as the world above seemed to collapse. If you think of a refugee carrying it across borders, using it sparingly to guide a path or warm trembling hands, it becomes not a trinket but a survival tool, something imbued with the weight of memory and suffering. What makes artifacts like this truly remarkable is not their physical form but the silence they carry, the way they invite us to imagine the untold human stories behind them, stories that will never be fully reconstructed, but that we sense in the worn wax and charred sticks. Unlike monuments which shout their presence across centuries, these objects whisper, and it is in the whisper that we hear the most intimate truths about the human experience, that in times of trial, people turned to whatever they had, and even the smallest flame could be enough to guide them through. And so the candle and matches, resting now in a museum case, ask us to reflect on our own relationship with comfort and survival, because we live in an age where light is taken for granted, where we rarely pause to appreciate the miracle of fire at our fingertips. Yet it was not so long ago that humanity clung to such fragile tools in order to endure. And when you sit quietly and imagine being in their place, you begin to realize that what we dismiss as trivial might in fact be among the most powerful reminders of resilience we possess. Steniosaurus bone. It's hard to believe, but large crocodiles were once a fairly common sight along this part of the Yorkshire coast. We're talking, of course, about the Jurassic period, around 160 million years ago, when this land looked nothing like it does today. If you were to step back into that time, the sea would stretch out wide and warm, filled with creatures that seem almost alien to our eyes, and the skies would be patrolled by flying reptiles with wingspans larger than a car. And somewhere along the shallows, lurking just beneath the surface, or basking on mudflats, were the ancestors of the crocodiles we know today. One of them being the Steniosaurus. The name Steniosaurus means narrow lizard, a reference to its long, slender snout, which was packed with sharp teeth designed for snatching fish from the waves. Unlike the modern crocodile, this creature spent much of its life in marine environments, adapted to living in saltwater seas. Imagine an animal about the length of a modern-day alligator, but with a body built more like a streamlined hunter, able to navigate the coastal waters of Jurassic Britain. Fossil evidence tells us that Steniosaurus was not rare. In fact, it was a successful species, one of the many marine reptiles that thrived during this age of giants. What makes its story remarkable is how such bones, fragments of creatures that died over 100 million years ago, managed to survive the colossal changes that reshaped the Earth. Over millennia, as the animal's body sank into the soft seabed, it was slowly covered with silt, mud, and sand. The soft tissues decayed away, leaving behind bones and teeth. Minerals then began to seep in, replacing the original structures and hardening them into stone. What was once a living, breathing predator became part of the fossil record, waiting patiently in silence beneath layers of rock until erosion, storms, and time brought fragments back into the daylight. On the Yorkshire coast, the cliffs are constantly shifting. Every year, wind and waves break away chunks of land, and with them, hidden fossils tumble down onto the beaches. For local collectors and paleontologists, it's like a treasure hunt, not for gold or jewels but for glimpses into an ancient world. Among these finds are pieces of Steniosaurus bone, often dark, smooth, and heavy with mineralization, very different from ordinary stone. To the untrained eye, it might seem like just another rock, but when studied closely, it reveals the unmistakable texture of once living bone, a connection to a predator that ruled these waters so long ago. What is fascinating about the Steniosaurus is how its story reflects the changing face of our planet. At the time it lived, the landmass that would one day become Britain was located closer to the equator, basking in a warmer climate. Tropical seas teemed with ammonites, belemnites, and fish, all of which would have been prey for this narrow-snouted hunter. It's hard to reconcile that image with the rugged, often cold Yorkshire coast we know today, yet the fossils prove it beyond doubt. These ancient crocodiles remind us that the world we live in is far from permanent. Coastlines shift, climates change, and entire species rise and fall. The Steniosaurus bone also serves as a reminder of survival and extinction. While crocodiles as a group managed to endure mass extinctions that wiped out countless other reptiles, specific species like Steniosaurus eventually disappeared. Why? The reasons are complex, tied to evolving ecosystems, shifting continents, and changing climates. New predators emerged, prey species declined, and the balance of the seas shifted. Over time, the once successful Steniosaurus faded into history, its only legacy being the fossilized remains we discover today. Holding such a bone in your hand is both humbling and surreal. It feels solid, weighty, yet it represents something that once pulsed with life. You can almost picture it as part of a jawbone, clamping down on a struggling fish, or perhaps part of a limb that once pushed powerfully through the sea. Each fossil is not just a stone, it is a frozen moment from an ancient drama of survival, preserved through unimaginable stretches of time. The discovery of Steniosaurus bones also highlights the role of amateurs and enthusiasts in paleontology. Many of the fossils found along the Yorkshire coast are spotted not by professional scientists, but by curious walkers, collectors, and local fossil hunters. These finds often make their way into museums where they can be studied and preserved for future generations. Without these chance discoveries, many of the details about Steniosaurus and its world might still lie buried, hidden beneath the cliffs. And so, the Steniosaurus bone becomes more than just a fossil. It becomes a bridge, a link between the modern coastline, with its crashing waves and shifting sands, and the ancient seaways of the Jurassic, where reptilian hunters lurked beneath the surface. It tells us that even in the most ordinary-seeming places, there are extraordinary stories waiting to be uncovered. It shows us that time does not erase everything, that fragments of the past can endure, silent witnesses to worlds we can only imagine. When you think about it, the Yorkshire coast is not just a stretch of cliffs and beaches, it is a library written in stone, each fossil a page in the story of life on Earth. The Steniosaurus bone is one of those pages, and though it may seem small compared to the skeletons of dinosaurs displayed in museums, its importance is undeniable. It is proof of a predator that once thrived in warm Jurassic seas, an animal that lived, hunted, and eventually died, leaving behind just enough for us to piece together its story. The more you look at a fossil like this, the more you realize how fragile life is, and how vast time truly is. Millions of years separate us from the Steniosaurus, yet here we are, able to hold a piece of its body in our hands. It challenges us to think about our own place in history, what will survive of us, and what traces of our world will remain for future beings to uncover. The Steniosaurus bone quietly poses these questions, reminding us that everything changes and nothing is truly permanent. And so, as you imagine that ancient coastline with crocodile-like hunters gliding through shallow waters, take a moment to reflect on the strange continuity of life. The Steniosaurus is gone, but crocodiles remain. The seas have shifted, the continents have drifted, yet fossils still surface, giving us small but powerful glimpses into a world that would otherwise be lost forever. The Steniosaurus bone is not just a relic, it is a voice from deep time, whispering to us across 160 million years, telling us that life endures, transforms, and leaves its mark in stone. The Swinney Notebook. It may look like just an old notebook, a modest collection of handwritten pages bound together in faded covers, but sometimes the simplest objects can carry within them a lifetime of stories. This is the case with what is known today as the Swinney Notebook, a relic that would likely have been forgotten if not for the generosity of the family who chose to share it with the world. The notebook belonged to a man named William Swinney, a local gentleman from Scarborough. He lived during a time when documenting one's personal thoughts, accounts, and records was far more than a habit. It was a way of preserving a fragment of oneself against the passage of time. The notebook, along with a package of related family documents, was eventually donated by his relatives to the Scarborough Museums. And while it may seem humble compared to ancient artifacts or archaeological treasures, this notebook opens a window into both the personal life of William and the broader history of the community in which he lived. Think for a moment about how fragile personal histories can be. Families often keep documents, letters, photographs, or diaries tucked away in drawers and attics, hidden from the wider world. Unless they are passed down with care or donated to institutions, they risk disappearing forever. But here, through the survival of William's notebook, we get something unusual, a direct, unfiltered glimpse into the life of a man who might otherwise have remained a mere name in public records. When you picture the notebook, imagine not just the worn cover or the faded ink, but the human hand that held the pen. These weren't words written for publication or performance. They were the private traces of a man's life, his thoughts, his records, and his reflections. Every curve of the handwriting carries his personality. The pauses, the way certain words might be emphasized, the occasional smudge on the paper, all of these remind us that this was not just a record, but the lived experience of a real person. So who exactly was William Swinney? The documents that accompany the notebook paint him as no ordinary figure. He was considered an extraordinary gentleman of his community, someone engaged not only with his family but with the life of Scarborough itself. Through his notes we see the outlines of a man interested in more than the day-to-day chores. There are glimpses of his intellect, his curiosity, and his awareness of the world around him. Now it's important to consider the time and place in which William lived. Scarborough, with its unique position on the Yorkshire coast, was a town of both tradition and transformation. The sea had always defined the lives of its inhabitants: fishermen, traders, sailors, and those drawn by the health resorts and coastal tourism of later years. It was a place where the rhythm of the waves matched the rhythm of human life. And here, in the midst of it all, William wrote down his world in a notebook. What makes his writings compelling is not that they describe monumental events or great battles, but that they capture the texture of ordinary life. Often these quieter voices are the ones lost in the grand sweep of history. We read about kings, wars, and revolutions, but seldom about the daily struggles, routines, and observations of individuals like William. Yet it is precisely this sort of perspective that allows us to understand history as something lived, not just recorded in official documents. Imagine sitting with this notebook open in front of you. The handwriting might require a moment to adjust to, shaped by an era when penmanship was taught with patience and discipline. You turn the pages slowly, aware that each word was carefully chosen. Perhaps you notice entries about his family, notes on the weather, reflections on the people he met, or the routines of his work. Some sections might read like lists, others like diary entries, and still others might reveal his personal philosophy. Every page is a small act of resistance against forgetting. William may not have realized it at the time, but by putting pen to paper, he ensured that a piece of himself would outlast his physical life. And now, decades or even centuries later, you can still hear his voice whispering through the faded ink. The value of the Swinney notebook is not only in what it says, but in what it represents. It reminds us that history is not built only on grand monuments or spectacular discoveries. It is also built on small, intimate records like this, kept alive through families, preserved through time, and finally entrusted to museums where they can be shared. For Scarborough museums, receiving the Swinney notebook was more than just acquiring another item in their collection. It was gaining a story, a human connection, and a resource that could be studied, displayed, and shared with the public. Visitors might walk past countless objects behind glass cases, but when they stop at a personal notebook like this one, they are drawn into a relationship with the person who wrote it. They are reminded that history is not abstract but human. As you reflect on the Swinney notebook, consider how many other stories might remain hidden in family archives around the world. Each letter, each page, and each photograph waiting in a drawer has the potential to illuminate lives otherwise forgotten. The preservation of these items is not simply about nostalgia, it's about keeping alive the complex, layered record of our shared human experience. In the quiet of Scarborough, on display for those who take the time to look closely, William Swinney's notebook now sits as a silent witness to the passage of time. It stands as both a deeply personal artifact and a universal reminder that even the smallest records of our lives can someday carry great meaning. So when you imagine Scarborough's history, don't picture only the grand events or the dramatic shifts. Picture also the hand of William Swinney, writing in his notebook by lamplight. Picture the ink drying slowly, the page turning, and another fragment of his life being carefully preserved. What may have seemed ordinary in his lifetime has now become extraordinary in ours, a bridge across time, connecting the quiet life of one man to the curiosity of future generations, and that is the enduring power of something as humble as a notebook, the Dutch tile. If you were to walk into an old European home, perhaps tucked away in the Netherlands, or even carried abroad by trade centuries ago, you might notice something easily overlooked at first glance, a small tile set neatly into the wall. It might look simple, painted in a soft blue and white glaze, but this single piece of ceramic carries with it not only beauty, but also a story that stretches back to the 17th century, a time when art, religion, and craftsmanship were bound together in the daily lives of people. This Dutch tile, now preserved as a museum piece, is one such example. It is decorated with an image believed to be the biblical scene of the baby Moses, being placed into the bulrushes by his mother. For those who know the story, Moses was born at a time of danger, when the king of Egypt had ordered that every newborn Hebrew boy be killed. His mother, desperate to save him, placed him into a basket and set him among the reeds of the Nile River, hoping that fate and faith would keep him safe. According to the Bible, he was later discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the royal household, a child destined for greatness. The story itself is powerful, but what makes this tile so compelling is how such a scene ended up depicted on a square piece of ceramic created in the Netherlands hundreds of years ago. During the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was at the height of its golden age. Trade, exploration, and art flourished. Ships sailed as far as the Americas, Africa, and Asia, bringing back not only goods but also new ideas, images, and styles. Dutch artisans became famous for their blue and white pottery, inspired by Chinese porcelain that had made its way to Europe through trade. These influences blended into something distinctively Dutch, and tiles like this one became common household features. They were not just decorations. Tiles were practical. They could be used to cover walls near fireplaces or stoves, protecting surfaces from heat and soot. But they were also deeply expressive, with hand-painted designs ranging from ships and windmills to flowers, animals, and biblical scenes. For many households, tiles served as small canvases for storytelling, reminders of faith, and glimpses into distant lands. When we look at this particular tile, we see the combination of art and devotion. The artist, whose name has been lost to history, chose to capture a single moment, a baby, set adrift in reeds, watched over by the hand of faith. To the family that once owned it, the tile may have symbolized hope, protection, or the idea of trust in divine providence. Every time they sat by the fire, or passed through their home, this image would have been there, silently reminding them of the power of faith and survival against impossible odds. But tiles like this also carried another story, one of global connection. The use of cobalt blue in its design was not a local Dutch invention, but rather a material that had traveled halfway across the world. Cobalt pigments were imported from Persia and the East, prized for their intensity and durability. The painting style was shaped by both European traditions and Asian influence. What seems like a simple household decoration is in fact a reminder of the global exchanges of the 17th century, when ideas, materials, and artistry flowed across borders and oceans. Now preserved in a museum, this tile becomes more than just a piece of ceramic. It is a link to the past, to the lives of the people who once valued it, to the artisans who painted it, and to the biblical story it depicts. It invites us to reflect on how art was not confined to grand canvases or cathedrals, but often lived in the very heart of ordinary homes. As you imagine this tile, picture the home it once adorned. Perhaps it was a modest Dutch household, where children played nearby and the fireplace glowed in the evenings. Or maybe it was later carried abroad, part of the trade that spread Dutch tiles across Europe and even to the colonies. Wherever it traveled, it brought with it not only a moment of beauty but also a story, a reminder of survival, faith, and artistry. This single piece of ceramic may be small, but its story is vast. It tells of a child in danger, a mother's desperate hope, an empire of trade and craftsmanship, and the way faith and beauty were woven into the fabric of everyday life. And as we linger with it now, we realize how even the most ordinary-seeming objects can hold extraordinary worlds within them. The Reeves Herbarium, pressed plants, preserved knowledge. At first glance, a collection of flattened plants mounted on sheets of paper may not seem like something that could carry great significance. To modern eyes, a herbarium can appear almost quaint. Pressed leaves, dried flowers, faded stems carefully glued and labeled. They look more like keepsakes of a gardener's scrapbook than tools of science. Yet the Reeves Herbarium, and collections like it, played a profound role in shaping our understanding of the natural world. These pages of preserved plants are more than fragile relics. They are time capsules, carrying with them centuries of observation, knowledge, and questions about the living environment that surrounded earlier generations. The Reeves Herbarium itself dates back to a period when naturalists were obsessed with classification. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a flourishing of interest in cataloging the diversity of life. For men like John Reeves, who lent his name to this collection, plants were not simply objects of beauty. They were puzzles to be sorted, named, described, and placed within an ever-expanding framework of scientific order. Each pressed leaf represented a story, a landscape walked, a specimen carefully chosen, and an attempt to capture life in a form that could last beyond its season. Imagine Reeves traveling across landscapes in Britain, or encountering specimens from far-flung places carried back through trade routes and colonial expeditions. Each plant pressed into the herbarium was more than a personal find. It was evidence. Evidence of biodiversity, of the richness of regions, of new and unknown species waiting to be studied. His collection helped make the unfamiliar familiar. By preserving plants in this way, Reeves and his contemporaries allowed scholars who never set foot in distant lands to see, compare, and study species that otherwise would have remained beyond their reach. The method of pressing plants may appear old-fashioned to us, but it was ingenious. A plant collected fresh from the field would be placed between sheets of absorbent paper and weighted to flatten it. Over time, as moisture left the specimen, the plant would dry out while still retaining its structural features. Leaves would keep their shape, flowers would hold their arrangement, stems would remain distinguishable. Though colors often faded, enough detail remained for later scientists to identify species, note distinguishing features, and trace relationships between plants. In an age before photography, this was the closest one could come to freezing a plant in time, and while it may lack the vibrancy of a living specimen, the herbarium sheet carries an authority of its own. A properly mounted plant, with its label noting the date, location, and collector, becomes an irreplaceable scientific record. For botanists, such sheets are as valuable as manuscripts are to historians. They provide a window into the ecology of a particular moment, preserving details of what grew where and when. Reeves' collection, like others of its kind, became a foundation for later discoveries. Consider, for instance, the work of Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist, who gave us the system of binomial nomenclature, genus and species that we still use today. Without the preserved specimens housed in collections across Europe, Linnaeus could not have compared plants from different continents so effectively. Herbariums allowed naturalists to build networks of knowledge across oceans, linking explorers, collectors, and scholars into a shared conversation about the living world. What makes the Reeves Herbarium especially valuable today is the way it bridges past and present. Modern scientists still consult these old sheets, not only to confirm identifications or trace the history of a species, but also to investigate environmental change. By analyzing the chemical residues left in pressed specimens, researchers can detect traces of pollutants or shifts in atmospheric conditions from centuries ago. A pressed leaf, silent and fragile, may hold clues about rising industrial emissions or changing soil chemistry. In this way, the herbarium continues to speak, even to questions its creator could never have imagined. There is also a cultural story here. Collections like Reeves were assembled during a period when Europe's gaze was increasingly global. Plants from Asia, Africa, and the Americas arrived in the form of seeds, cuttings, and specimens. Some of these became prized ornamental garden plants in Britain, others became economically vital crops. Yet behind this movement of flora lay histories of empire, trade, and colonization. The herbarium sheet, so calm in its appearance, conceals the restless movements of ships, merchants, and collectors who made such exchanges possible. Walking through the pages of the Reeves Herbarium is like moving across centuries. Each sheet preserves a specimen, not only of a plant, but of human curiosity and ambition. One might find a common weed, pressed with the same care as a rare exotic. To Reeves and his peers, both were worth preserving. For them, the act of collection was an act of honoring the diversity of the natural world, of ensuring that no detail went unnoticed. In modern times, digital imaging has extended the life of these collections even further. The Reeves Herbarium, once accessible only to those who could travel to its shelves, can now be studied remotely. High-resolution scans allow botanists and students worldwide to examine specimens without physically touching them. This reduces wear and tear on the fragile originals while spreading their knowledge far beyond the confines of an archive. Yet there is still something irreplaceable about holding one of these sheets in your hands. The texture of the paper, the faint scent of age, the fragile skeleton of a flower pressed centuries ago. These carry a presence that no scan can fully capture. It is a reminder that science is not only about data, but also about connection to the past, to the people who built the foundations of knowledge, and to the living world that inspired them. In this sense, the Reeves Herbarium stands as a quiet monument. It is not grand like a cathedral, nor dramatic like a ruined city, but in its silence lies an enduring strength. It tells us that knowledge does not always come from spectacle, but from patience, from the careful act of pressing one leaf at a time, and from the belief that even the most ordinary plant deserves a place in the record of history. And so, when we look at these pages today, we are reminded that what may appear old-fashioned or quaint is in fact a cornerstone of modern science, pressed between the paper and time itself. The plants of the Reeves Herbarium continue to whisper truths about the past landscapes they came from, about the evolution of botany, and about the enduring value of preserving even the smallest details of our natural world. The ship's compass. If you were to step aboard a great wooden ship a few centuries ago, the first thing you would notice is not the towering sails or the creak of the timbers, but the way every movement of the vessel is guided by one humble yet extraordinary instrument, the ship's compass. At first glance, it may seem like nothing more than a needle enclosed within a brass case. But to the sailors of the past, it was as essential as food or water. Without it, vast journeys across unknown seas would have been impossible. This particular compass, housed in its brass case, tells a quiet story of the age when seafaring meant venturing into the unknown, with no guarantee of return. The clue lies in its construction. The compass rests upon gimbals, those ingenious pivoted supports that allow the instrument to remain level no matter how violently the ship may pitch or roll. Imagine the deck beneath you, rising and falling with the waves, the horizon disappearing and reappearing with every swell. Yet the compass needle, balanced carefully upon its pivots, continues to point steadily north. This stability transformed the dangerous art of navigation into something almost scientific, almost predictable. Centuries ago, before such instruments were common, sailors were forced to rely upon the stars and the coastline. When clouds obscured the heavens, or when ships pushed far into open waters, they were left to guesswork. It is not difficult to imagine the fear of drifting too far, of losing sight of the familiar, with no way to know where safety lay. The introduction of the compass changed everything. It gave seafarers a new confidence, allowing them to leave the comfort of the shore and strike boldly across oceans that once seemed infinite and impassable. The compass itself may appear simple, but it embodies principles that reach deep into the mysteries of the Earth. Its needle, magnetized and restless, aligns itself with the planet's magnetic field. To ancient observers, this must have seemed a kind of magic, an invisible force that tugged the metal in one fixed direction. And yet this unseen force became the guide that allowed ships to cross vast stretches of open sea. Imagine the relief of a captain standing on the deck in the black of night, unable to see a single landmark, yet reassured by the steady needle pointing northward. A ship's compass was not only a tool but a guardian. Entire crews depended upon its reliability. Their food, their health, their very survival often hinged on reaching port before supplies ran out. A slight miscalculation could mean weeks adrift in hostile waters, and so the compass became a silent authority on the vessel, its reading treated with respect, its position carefully guarded. Now picture the hands that once touched this very instrument, weathered fingers of sailors who trusted it more than the shifting skies above. The brass casing would have glimmered faintly in the lantern light below deck, its gimbals swaying gently as the vessel rocked. One can almost hear the creak of timber, the rush of the sea against the hull, and the murmurs of men glancing nervously toward the compass, searching for reassurance in its steady direction. But this compass, like many artifacts, holds within it a story not only of technology but of ambition. It was with instruments like these that humanity reached across the globe. The Age of Discovery, as we now call it, was built on a foundation of such tools. Without them, explorers like Magellan, Columbus, and countless unnamed captains could never have braved the open ocean. With the compass, the world seemed suddenly within reach. Islands, continents, and trade routes opened themselves to human exploration. For better or for worse, empires expanded, cultures collided, and the map of the world was redrawn, all because a floating needle could be trusted to point the way. It is also worth remembering that the compass did not end danger at sea. Storms still swallowed ships whole, reefs tore apart hulls, and disease ravaged crews. Yet the compass reduced one form of terror, the terror of not knowing where you were. It gave sailors a constant reference, a whisper of order within the chaos of the waves. Even today, as modern vessels are guided by satellites and digital systems, the compass remains a symbol of navigation itself. There is something profoundly human in the way we return to it, as if trusting the Earth's magnetic pull feels more natural than trusting the signals of orbiting machines. Mariners still keep compasses aboard, not only as backups but as reminders of the long chain of seafarers who once relied on them as their lifeline. And when we look upon this particular brass-cased compass, mounted carefully in its gimbals, we glimpse more than metal and glass. We glimpse centuries of ocean journeys, of men and women standing on unknown shores, of cargoes that shape civilizations. It is a modest object, but one whose presence echoes across time. Without instruments like it, the great crossings of the world's oceans would have remained unthinkable. The compass turned the vast frightening seas into highways of exploration, trade, and human connection. So as you look upon this ship's compass, imagine the countless lives it may have guided. Imagine the dark nights at sea, when the only certainty came from the quivering needle pointing north. Imagine the steady hands of navigators, the trust of entire crews, and the way this small device carried humanity across the waters to meet its own future. The brass may be tarnished now, the gimbals still and silent, but in its time, it was more than an instrument. It was a promise of direction, a fragile reassurance that even in the wildest seas, there was always a way home. The brown crab. The edible brown crab, known scientifically as Cancer pagarus, is one of the most recognizable crustaceans of the North Atlantic and North Sea. With its broad, oval shell and its distinctively powerful claws, it has been an important part of both coastal ecosystems and human diets for centuries. But to simply call it a crab you can eat would miss the remarkable story behind its biology, its survival strategies, and the way humans have interacted with it across time. This creature carries with it a quiet history of adaptation and endurance, shaped by the relentless rhythms of the sea. If you were to stand on the rocky shores of northern Europe and peer down into a tide pool at low tide, you might see the brown crab nestled between stones, its rough shell blending with the seabed. At first glance it seems ordinary, but the closer you look, the more fascinating details emerge. Its carapace, the hardened upper shell, has a subtle reddish-brown coloration, sometimes mottled with darker patches. The edges are crimped into a pie crust shape, which is why in many regions it is nicknamed the pie crust crab. This adaptation helps it disguise itself among sand, rock, and seaweed. What makes the brown crab especially notable is its size and strength. Adult crabs often measure up to 25 centimeters across the shell, with some of the largest individuals reaching over 3 kilograms in weight. Its claws are unequal. One is usually larger and crushing, built for breaking open shells of mussels and whelks, while the other is more slender, suited for cutting and handling food. This dimorphism in the claws is not random, but a specialized adaptation, making the crab both a hunter and a scavenger of the seabed. The brown crab's range is vast. It thrives in cold to temperate waters of the North Atlantic, stretching from Norway down to Portugal, and it even extends into parts of the Mediterranean. Along rocky coasts and sandy seabeds, at depths from the shallow intertidal zone down to about 100 meters, it plays an essential ecological role. By feeding on mollusks, smaller crustaceans, and detritus, it helps regulate the balance of benthic life. Its presence is a reminder of how interconnected the ocean floor truly is. Every predator, every grazer, every scavenger, working as part of a larger cycle. Life for the brown crab begins in a way that feels almost otherworldly. After mating, females carry thousands, sometimes over 2 million eggs under their abdomen, held in place by fine appendages. The eggs remain there for up to 8 months, sheltered and aerated, until they hatch. When they finally release into the water, the young are not miniature crabs, but free-floating larvae. These larvae drift with the currents, moving wherever the ocean takes them. For several weeks they pass through multiple stages, gradually transforming until finally they settle on the seabed and take on the form of the crabs we recognize. This process is not without danger. The vast majority of larvae will never reach adulthood, falling prey to fish, jellyfish, or simply being lost in currents that carry them too far from suitable habitats. Yet the strategy of producing millions of eggs ensures that enough survive to keep populations steady. It is a strategy written into the very code of the species, abundance in the face of inevitable loss. As the crabs grow, they face another challenge, their own exoskeleton. Like all crustaceans, the brown crab cannot grow continuously. Its hard shell is both armor and prison. When the body inside becomes too large, the crab must shed its exoskeleton in a process called molting. This is a vulnerable time. The crab splits its shell and pulls itself out, soft and unprotected, before the new exoskeleton hardens. In those hours or days, it must hide from predators, relying on crevices and camouflage until its armor is strong again. Over the course of its life, a crab may molt dozens of times, each molt a step toward maturity. The lifespan of a brown crab can stretch surprisingly long, often 20 to 30 years in the wild. Such longevity is rare among crustaceans of its size. This makes it not only a key part of the food chain, but also a long-term participant in the ecology of the seabed. Over decades, an individual crab may experience shifts in water temperature, storms that reshape coastlines, and human impacts such as fishing and pollution. To endure for so long in such a harsh and changing world is itself a quiet marvel. For humans, the brown crab has been a resource for centuries. Along the coasts of Britain, France, and Scandinavia, fishing communities have relied on it for food and trade. Its meat is prized for its flavor, with the white meat from the claws considered particularly delicate, while the brown meat from the body is rich and strong. Historical records show that in some coastal villages, crab fisheries were central to local economies as early as the medieval period. Boats would set out with baited pots, lowering them to the seabed, and returning later to haul in the heavy, clawed catch. Modern fisheries still rely on much the same principle, though with far more sophisticated gear and larger scales of operation. Today, the brown crab is one of Europe's most valuable shellfish, with thousands of tons landed each year. Ports in Scotland, Ireland, and England are especially active in the trade, exporting crab meat across Europe and Asia. Yet this commercial importance also brings challenges. Overfishing, changes in sea temperature, and habitat disruption pose risks to populations. Sustainable management is now essential if this species is to remain abundant for future generations. Beyond its role as food, the brown crab carries cultural significance. In folklore, crabs often symbolize persistence and resilience, creatures that move sideways yet always find their way. Fishermen, observing their strength and determination, have long respected them as creatures of the tides. In some coastal towns, festivals and markets feature crab prominently, celebrating not just the harvest but the enduring link between people and the sea. When you imagine a crab scuttling across the seabed, it is easy to forget the complexity of its existence. Each movement, each decision, whether to attack a mussel or retreat into a crevice, is part of a survival strategy honed over millions of years. Its claws are more than tools, they are the outcome of evolutionary refinement. Its shell is more than armor, it is a record of growth, a visible marker of how many times the creature has risked everything to shed its past and emerge anew. And perhaps that is what makes the brown crab worth contemplating in a slow, reflective way. It is a reminder that the creatures of the ocean, however ordinary they may seem, carry within them extraordinary adaptations. Their survival is not guaranteed by strength alone, but by a combination of patience, strategy, and an ability to endure. For those listening in the quiet of the night, this realization brings its own kind of calm. Imagine the crab resting beneath a ledge, the tide above surging in and out, moonlight filtering down through shallow waters. It waits, still and silent, until the scent of prey drifts close. Then, with sudden precision, it strikes with its crushing claw, feeding itself for another day. This moment plays out not just once, but countless times across the seafloors of the Atlantic. Entire populations repeat this dance, unseen but essential, shaping the world below the waves. For every crab that ends up in a pot or on a plate, there are thousands more continuing this quiet life cycle. And within that cycle lies a profound lesson. Survival is not a matter of dominance, but of balance. The brown crab thrives because it takes just enough, adapts when it must, and yields to the greater forces of tide and current. In the end, to learn about the brown crab is to see the ocean itself more clearly. Its story is the ocean's story, of abundance and loss, of adaptation and resilience, of quiet strength sustained across centuries. When you next look at the sea, consider what lives beneath its surface, carrying on with their patient, hidden lives. Among them is the brown crab, a creature whose sideways walk has carried it through time, leaving behind not footprints but the faint impressions of claws across sand, erased with every new tide. The Jet Cross. When archaeologists began a large-scale excavation at Scarborough Castle in the 1920s, they expected to uncover traces of the medieval fortress's long and turbulent history. The castle, perched dramatically on a headland overlooking the North Sea, had been the site of countless events, from medieval sieges to English Civil War bombardments. Its ruins had long been a landmark, a reminder of how time and conflict can shape a place. But during the excavation they found something unexpected. Amid the broken stones and collapsed walls, they uncovered a small object that stood out not because of its size or grandeur, but because of what it was made from, and the form it carried. It was a jet cross, carved from the deep black fossilized material known as Whitby jet. At first glance, the cross might seem like a simple devotional object, perhaps once worn as a pendant or kept as a personal token, but its discovery within the layers of Scarborough Castle adds layers of meaning and raises questions that go beyond mere decoration. Who owned this cross? Why was it left here? And what does it tell us about the people who lived, fought, and prayed within these walls? To answer those questions, we must step back into the intertwined history of Scarborough, Whitby jet, and the religious and cultural life of medieval England. Whitby jet has been prized since prehistoric times, formed from the fossilized remains of ancient Archaeological trees that lived around 1800 million years ago during the Jurassic period. Jet is found along the cliffs and shores near Whitby, just a short distance up the coast from Scarborough. Its deep glossy black surface could be polished to a striking sheen, making it a favored material for ornaments, beads, and amulets. In the Roman era, jet was widely used across Britain, often shaped into rings and pendants believed to protect against evil. The Romans valued jet for its supposed magical qualities. It was thought to ward off illness, detect poison, and even chase away snakes when burned. Long after the Romans had left, the people of medieval Yorkshire continued to work jet, passing down techniques and traditions of carving it into religious and personal items. The jet cross from Scarborough Castle fits neatly into this tradition. Unlike metal or stone, jet was a material linked not only to beauty, but also to spiritual symbolism. In the medieval mind, its deep blackness carried associations with mourning, protection, and the divine mystery of death and resurrection. To hold or wear a jet cross was not just a fashion choice, it could have been a way to carry faith close to the body, a protective emblem in times of danger, or a cherished reminder of devotion. Scarborough Castle itself was no stranger to danger. Built originally in the 12th century, it grew into one of the strongest fortresses in northern England. Its position on the clifftop offered sweeping views across land and sea, a perfect vantage point for defending the Yorkshire coast. Over the centuries, it saw sieges, bombardments, and periods of decay and rebuilding. By the time of the English Civil War in the 17th century, The castle was a critical royalist stronghold, and it endured heavy shelling from parliamentarian forces. Within such a turbulent setting, small personal objects like the jet cross remind us of the individuals who lived through these larger historical dramas. We can imagine a soldier, perhaps far from home, carrying the cross as a token of comfort. Or perhaps it belonged to a member of the garrison's family, a wife or child who lived within the castle walls during quieter times. The fact that it survived, buried beneath centuries of stone and soil, means it outlasted its original owner, slipping quietly into the layers of the castle's history, until it was brought to light once more. But beyond its personal story, the Jet Cross also speaks to Scarborough's connection with Whitby, the source of jet. The two towns are linked, not only geographically, but also economically and spiritually. Whitby itself was home to an important monastery founded in the 7th century, a place where faith and craftsmanship thrived. By the Middle Ages, Whitby's reputation for jet objects was already established. Pilgrims and traders sought out jet crosses and beads, often associating them with Saint Hilda of Whitby, the abbess who had played a central role in the spread of Christianity in the region. To wear a jet cross might have been to carry a fragment of Whitby's sacred landscape, a tangible connection to one of northern England's spiritual centers. The discovery of the cross in the 1920s also reflects a broader moment in British archaeology. At that time, systematic excavation of castles and ancient sites was becoming more common. Scarborough Castle, long a ruin admired by artists and tourists, was being studied in a new, more scientific way. Each artifact recovered, from pottery shards to military remains, helped reconstruct the everyday life of those who had once lived there. The jet cross stood out, however, because it carried not only material value, but also symbolic resonance. Unlike a broken pot or a rusty nail, this was an object tied to identity, belief, and personal memory. Today, the jet cross remains a quiet but powerful reminder of the intersection between faith, material culture, and history. It is not as dramatic as the shattered walls of Scarborough Castle, nor as imposing as the fortress gatehouse. Yet in its smallness lies a different kind of power. It reminds us that history is not only about kings, wars, and grand events. It is also about the silent objects carried in pockets, worn around necks, or held in prayer during moments of fear. These objects survive not because they were meant to dominate the landscape, but because they mattered deeply to individual lives. When you stand today on the headland at Scarborough, looking out at the expanse of the sea, it is easy to imagine how a small black cross might have been clutched in someone's hand centuries ago. Perhaps during a storm, when waves battered the cliffs, perhaps during a siege, when cannon fire shook the walls, or perhaps simply during a quiet evening, when someone whispered a prayer for safety and held the cross as a source of strength. The jet cross allows us to glimpse those personal, unrecorded moments, the side of history that rarely finds its way into chronicles but remains preserved in the ground. And so, this little carved cross bridges two worlds. On one side, it is a material artifact, a product of geological time and human craft, fashioned from a fossilized tree that grew millions of years before humans walked the earth. On the other, it is a human object, shaped and imbued with meaning, carried through moments of faith, danger, and everyday life. When found within Scarborough Castle, it becomes something more, a thread connecting personal devotion with the sweeping tides of history. As the 1920s archaeologists brushed away the soil that had hidden it, they were uncovering not just a cross, but a story of belief, resilience, and continuity. And even now, as it rests in museum collections, it speaks quietly to us. A fragment of Whitby's cliffs, carried into Scarborough's fortress, forgotten, buried, and then rediscovered. An object small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet vast enough in meaning to connect millions of years of geological history with the fleeting prayers of a medieval soldier or pilgrim. The jet cross reminds us that history's treasures are not always made of gold or silver. Sometimes they are carved from black stone, carried by ordinary people, and discovered centuries later as a silent witness to lives once lived. Penny-lick glasses. On the bustling promenades of Victorian England, long before ice cream cones and neatly packaged tubs became everyday indulgences, there was another, far more curious way to enjoy a frozen treat. Imagine standing by the seaside, the salty air brushing across your face, the laughter of families drifting along the boardwalk, and the distant sound of waves meeting the shore. Amid this lively scene, you approach a vendor pushing a cart laden with a block of ice, a tin container of frozen cream, and a stack of tiny glass dishes. These little objects, called penny-lick glasses, became an iconic yet short-lived part of British seaside history. The penny-lick was exactly what its name suggested, a small portion of ice cream served in a thick, heavy glass for just 1 penny. At a time when pennies carried weight and treats were luxuries, this simple indulgence held a special kind of magic. For many, it was not just about the taste of the ice cream, but the experience of holding that chilled glass, feeling the coolness press against the lips and savoring a spoonful, or more often just a lick of frozen sweetness. But the penny-lick glass was not a dainty serving bowl, nor was it particularly practical. These glasses were small, barely holding more than a mouthful or two. They were thick, heavy, and often had a deep hollow base that made the portion of ice cream look larger than it truly was. Vendors, knowing how to stretch their product, would carefully scoop the ice cream so that it perched on top of the glass, creating the illusion of abundance. Buyers, eager for a cold refreshment, often did not notice until it was too late that their penny had bought them little more than a fleeting taste. Despite their trickery, the penny-lick glass became immensely popular. It was affordable, accessible to the working class, and perfectly suited for the lively atmosphere of seaside towns. From Brighton to Scarborough, from Blackpool to Margate, children tugged on their parents' sleeves for just 1 penny to spend on a lick. Vendors could serve hundreds in a day, handing out and recollecting the glasses in quick succession. But here lies the darker side of this nostalgic tale. The penny-lick glasses were rarely washed between uses. Ice cream sellers, pressed for time and serving long queues, simply wiped the rim of the glass with a rag, often damp and dirty, and scooped on the next portion. In crowded streets where hygiene was not yet understood as we know it today, this created a serious public health hazard. Diseases such as tuberculosis and cholera spread alarmingly through these shared glasses. What had begun as a charming seaside delight became a silent contributor to illness in crowded urban and coastal centers. By the late 19th century, medical professionals and reformers began to campaign against the penny-lick. Public health authorities, increasingly aware of the dangers, pushed for stricter regulations. In 1898, penny-lick glasses were officially banned in London, and soon across much of Britain. Vendors had to find a replacement, and that change led to one of the most enduring icons of modern food culture, the edible cone. The invention of the ice cream cone transformed the way frozen desserts were enjoyed. Instead of returning a sticky glass, customers now held a crisp, edible vessel that required no washing and left no waste. It was a small change, yet it revolutionized how ice cream was sold, turning it into the treat we recognize today. The cone was not only practical but also added its own texture and flavor to the indulgence, creating a new sensory experience that delighted generations. Still, the penny-lick glass remains a fascinating window into Victorian and Edwardian life. These little glasses, many of which survive in museums and private collections, speak of a world balancing novelty and necessity, indulgence and ignorance. Their thick design, intended to survive thousands of uses, gives them a peculiar weight when held today. To imagine standing on a windy pier, glass in hand, savoring the tiniest scoop of ice cream, is to step back into a moment when life's pleasures were fleeting, yet cherished. The penny-lick also tells a broader story about how societies adapt. A simple glass forced people to think about hygiene, public health, and even fairness in trade. What was once an innocent seaside delight became a lesson in how quickly traditions can vanish when confronted with scientific understanding. In this sense, the penny-lick glass is more than a relic. It is a reminder of how small details in everyday life can shape broader cultural and historical shifts. Even now, collectors treasure these glasses not for their beauty, they are plain, almost utilitarian, but for the history they hold. To gaze upon one in a display case is to imagine the countless hands that once held it, the pennies exchanged, the brief smiles of children, and the warnings of doctors that eventually sealed its fate. And so the penny-lick glass lives on, not at seaside stalls or bustling promenades, but in the quiet halls of museums and in the stories we tell. It represents a moment in time when indulgence came in small, fleeting doses, when even a penny could buy happiness, and when society learned, through trial and error, that pleasure and safety must sometimes be balanced with care. William Smith Map. In the early 19th century, before satellites, before airplanes, and even before trains had transformed the speed at which people moved across Britain, there was one man walking the countryside with a notebook, a hammer, and an idea that no one else had ever pursued in such detail. His name was William Smith, and the work he produced, after years of solitary effort, became known as the map that changed the world. Today, geologists still look at it with awe. Historians consider it one of the most important scientific achievements in British history. Yet at the time of its creation, William Smith's journey was marked not by fame or wealth, but by hardship, dismissal, and even time in debtor's prison. To understand this extraordinary achievement, you have to picture England in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to change the fabric of society. Canals were being dug to transport coal and iron. Mines were opening across the country. Landowners and engineers wanted to know where coal seams ran, where clay could be found, and where stone lay buried beneath the rolling fields. But no one had yet created a clear, visual way of showing what lay under the surface. The landscape above ground was well known, drawn on maps for centuries. But below ground, it was all guesswork. William Smith was not a man from privilege. Born in 1769, the son of a village blacksmith in Oxfordshire, he had little formal education, but he had an intense curiosity and a gift for observation. As a boy, he noticed the way the land around him sloped, how rocks formed layers, and how fossils seemed to appear in predictable patterns. By the time he was a young man, he was apprenticed as a surveyor, measuring land for canals and construction projects. This work, though ordinary to others, gave him an extraordinary insight. As canal trenches cut through fields and hills, they revealed the hidden layers of the earth. Smith noticed that the layers, or strata, always appeared in the same order. A band of clay might appear above a layer of limestone, which in turn sat above sandstone, and the fossils embedded in those layers could be used to identify them. Certain fossils, like ammonites, were always found in the same layers and never above or below. This was revolutionary thinking at the time. Most people believed fossils were oddities, perhaps the remnants of a biblical flood, or just curiosities placed in stone by chance. But Smith recognized them as chronological markers, keys to understanding the deep history of the earth. It was from this insight that his great idea formed. If the layers could be identified and matched from place to place, then the underground structure of the whole country could be mapped. He realized that the hidden geology of Britain was not random but systematic, and he decided to dedicate his life to charting it. This was no easy task. Smith was not supported by universities or wealthy patrons. He was a working man, hired to survey canals, to plan drainage, to offer practical advice to landowners. He traveled constantly, mostly on foot or horseback, carrying notebooks filled with sketches. He marked down every cutting, every quarry, every riverbank where the layers of the earth revealed themselves. Over decades, he accumulated a mental picture of the underground Britain that no one else possessed. By 1815, after years of labor, Smith published his masterpiece, the first geological map of England, Wales, and part of Scotland. It was hand-colored, enormous in size, and unlike anything the world had ever seen. On its surface, the familiar outline of Britain stretched across the page. But instead of towns and roads being the focus, the land was divided into colored bands, each representing a different type of rock and layer beneath the soil. Suddenly, the underground world was visible. Coal seams could be traced, building stone could be predicted, and the fossil record could be understood in its proper order. The brilliance of the map was not just its accuracy, but its utility. For industry, it was invaluable. Engineers could plan mines more effectively. Farmers could understand the soil beneath their land. Scientists could compare fossils with confidence. Knowing the sequence of the rocks was consistent. It was nothing less than a new way of seeing the earth. But Smith himself did not immediately receive the recognition he deserved. Others copied his map and sold versions of it without giving him credit. He lacked the money to defend his work legally, and his financial troubles grew worse. Eventually, he was thrown into debtor's prison. For a time, it looked as though the man who had created one of the greatest intellectual achievements of his age would die in obscurity. Yet his story did not end there. Gradually, his work was recognized. The Geological Society of London, which had initially dismissed him, eventually acknowledged his achievement. He became known as the father of English geology. Later in life, he was awarded the first Wollaston Medal, the highest honor of the Geological Society. By then, his map had already transformed the way people thought about the earth beneath their feet. What makes Smith's achievement so compelling is not just the scientific breakthrough, but the personal journey. He was not a man of privilege. He was not supported by wealthy institutions. He was a solitary figure, walking across Britain, using his eyes, his hammer, and his stubborn determination to uncover patterns no one else had noticed. His life was filled with setbacks, but his work outlived him. Even today, modern geological maps owe their foundation to his vision. The colors may be updated, the boundaries more precise, but the principle that the earth can be read layer by layer, fossil by fossil, remains unchanged. If you ever see one of the surviving original copies of his 1815 map, you might be struck not only by its scientific precision, but by its beauty. The hand-colored bands sweep across the country like a patchwork quilt. It is both a work of science and a work of art. It is a reminder that knowledge sometimes comes not from institutions or laboratories, but from individuals willing to dedicate their lives to observation, persistence, and imagination. And so, William Smith's geological map is rightly called the map that changed the world. Not because it redrew political boundaries or guided armies, but because it opened a new dimension of understanding, an invisible world beneath our feet. A story of the earth written in stone, waiting to be read. Bellarmine Jug. If you were to walk through a European marketplace in the late 16th or 17th century, you might notice a curious type of jug standing proudly among the stalls of potters and traders. These stoneware vessels were broad in shape, often with a bulbous body and narrow neck, but what caught the eye was not their form but their decoration. Staring back from the surface was the striking face of a bearded man, pressed or molded into the clay. This was the Bellarmine jug, also known in some regions as the Bartman jug, a vessel that carried with it more than just ale or wine. It carried mystery, folklore, superstition, and cultural identity. The most distinctive feature of a Bellarmine jug is, of course, the face. A wide-eyed, wild-looking bearded man, his features almost exaggerated, with thick hair and sometimes a grim or mischievous expression. Historians have long debated exactly who this man was meant to represent. One theory points to a mythical figure, the Wild Man of the Woods, a character that lingered in European folklore for centuries. This figure represented untamed nature, a reminder of forces beyond civilization. By placing such a face on a jug, people may have felt they were binding some of that power, containing it within a vessel meant for everyday use. Another theory links the face to Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, a fierce Catholic figure of the Counter-Reformation who was known for his opposition to Protestant movements. In Protestant regions of Europe, especially in the Netherlands and northern Germany, it is possible that these jugs were produced with mocking intent, a way of caricaturing the cardinal's face into the clay as a sort of satire. Whether this was deliberate political mockery or simply coincidence remains unclear, but the name Bellarmine jug stuck in many places. What is fascinating is how widespread these jugs became. They originated in the Rhineland of Germany, particularly around Cologne and Frechen, where stoneware pottery was an important craft. The clay in that region fired at high temperatures, producing strong, durable stoneware that could hold liquids without seeping. These qualities made the jugs ideal for shipping alcohol, beer, wine, and spirits to all parts of Europe. As trade expanded, so too did the reach of the Bellarmine jug. From England to the Low Countries, from Scandinavia to the far reaches of colonial settlements, fragments of these bearded vessels still appear in archaeological digs today. One of the most intriguing aspects of Bellarmine jugs is their connection with superstition. Many were used in what are called witch bottles. These bottles were filled with items meant to ward off harmful magic, nails, pins, hair, or even urine, and then buried under hearths or thresholds to protect the household. The stern bearded face may have been seen as a guardian symbol glaring outward at any malevolent force that dared approach. Some archaeologists have uncovered such bottles intact, their contents preserved after centuries underground, a reminder of the very real fears that people carried with them in those times. Even when used in more ordinary settings, Bellarmine jugs carried an aura of character. They were not plain containers but objects with personality, a kind of silent presence in the household. Imagine sitting at a wooden table in a dimly lit tavern, the smell of smoke and ale in the air, and at the center of the gathering, a stout jug with a bearded face looking out. It must have felt as though the jug itself was a guest, a silent witness to the laughter, the songs, the arguments, and the countless stories that unfolded around it. Over time, the Bellarmine jug became so iconic that it was reproduced in countless variations. Some faces were fierce and almost grotesque, with bulging eyes and snarling mouths. Others were calmer, even comical. Some had additional decoration, like coats of arms, medallions, or patterns pressed into the clay. Each potter added their own interpretation, so no two jugs were exactly alike. For modern archaeologists, this means that each fragment can be studied to trace not just trade networks, but also the cultural exchanges between regions and workshops. The durability of these stoneware vessels means that they are still discovered in great numbers. Excavations of shipwrecks often reveal Bellarmine jugs packed carefully among the cargo, sometimes still sealed. Domestic sites across Europe and even early colonial America have turned up fragments or whole examples, showing just how global their reach became. To hold one today is to hold a direct connection with ordinary people of centuries past, their daily habits, and even their fears. There is also something quietly unsettling about the face on the jug. Even now, when you look at one in a museum case, the eyes seem to follow you. The beard and hair are rendered in rough texture, and the expression is ambiguous, hovering between watchful guardian and mocking presence. Perhaps that ambiguity was part of the appeal. It could represent strength, humor, superstition, or defiance, depending on who was looking at it. By the 18th century, the popularity of Bellarmine jugs had begun to fade. Styles changed, glassware became more common, and the need for stoneware diminished in some places. Yet the legacy of the bearded jugs endured, not only in collections but in folklore. The image of the bearded wild man still lingers in European imagination, and the connection to Cardinal Bellarmine still fuels debate among historians. Today, Bellarmine jugs are treasured as cultural artifacts. Museums showcase them not only for their craftsmanship, but also for the stories they tell about belief, identity, and humor in the early modern world. They remind us that even something as simple as a drinking vessel can carry layers of meaning. Political, spiritual, and social. When you think about it, these jugs served more than liquid. They served ideas. They sat on tables where politics were discussed. They were buried under floors to protect families, and they were carried across oceans as part of trade that shaped the modern world. Their bearded faces became symbols, adaptable to context, capable of inspiring fear, laughter, or respect. And so, when you encounter one today, you are not just looking at pottery, you are looking at a window into a vanished time, a time when people lived with one foot in folklore and the other in a changing, expanding world. A time when even an ordinary jug could be extraordinary, carrying within its clay the face of mystery. The eight-sided prism of Tiglath-Pileser I. In the ruins of the ancient city of Assur, long buried beneath the shifting sands of Iraq, archaeologists uncovered an extraordinary artifact that connects us directly to the ambitions of one of Mesopotamia's most powerful rulers. It is known today as the eight-sided prism of Tiglath-Pileser I, a remarkable clay prism covered on all sides with dense cuneiform inscriptions. This relic, dating to the late 2nd millennium BC, carries within its angled walls the voice of a king who ruled the Assyrian Empire with iron resolve between 1114 and 1076 BC. The prism is not just a document, it is a declaration of power. Each of its 8 carefully smoothed sides is inscribed with detailed accounts of Tiglath-Pileser's military campaigns, his victories, his conquests, and his claims to dominion over vast stretches of territory. From the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts beyond the Euphrates, the prism records battles, victories over rival kings, and the spoils taken in his name. To hold such an object, or even to imagine it, is to glimpse the way ancient rulers immortalized themselves, not in statues alone, but in words pressed permanently into clay. Cuneiform, with its wedge-shaped impressions, had been used for centuries by the time this prism was created. Yet here it was wielded with a different purpose. This was not a humble account book or an economic ledger. This was propaganda, a tool meant to echo the grandeur of Tiglath-Pileser's reign far beyond his lifetime. For every inscription carved into the clay, there was a message. Assyria was mighty, and its king was unchallenged. The prism was more than an archive, it was a weapon of memory. When scholars began deciphering these inscriptions, they found not only the record of battles but also descriptions of hunting expeditions, building projects, and the king's devotion to the gods who had, in his view, granted him divine authority. Tiglath-Pileser describes himself as chosen by the great deities of Assyria, guided by the will of the gods, and destined to expand his empire's reach. These lines echo the worldview of the ancient Mesopotamians, where power was inseparable from the sacred. Among the most striking passages are those detailing the king's encounters with distant lands and peoples. The prism records journeys to the Mediterranean coast, expeditions into forests where massive trees were cut and dragged back for building temples, and battles fought against tribes whose names would otherwise have been lost to time. Through this prism, entire regions that existed more than 3,000 years ago flicker back into view, not as abstract names but as real places tied to blood, conquest, and ambition. Yet the prism also raises questions. For all its detail, its perspective is entirely one-sided. It speaks only in the voice of Tiglath-Pileser, never those he conquered. To us today, it is both an extraordinary document and a reminder of how history can be shaped by the powerful. We hear nothing of the lives disrupted by his armies, the cities razed, or the people enslaved. The prism is silent on those details, and so we are left with an account that is as much myth-making as it is historical record. Still, for archaeologists and historians, the eight-sided prism is invaluable. It allows us to reconstruct the Assyrian world at the height of its expansion, giving names to places, campaigns, and even natural resources prized by the empire. Its survival across more than 3 millennia is remarkable in itself. Clay, hardened in the fire, has a way of enduring when parchment or wood cannot. The very medium that Tiglath-Pileser chose has ensured that his words outlasted empires. Today, fragments and examples of these Assyrian prisms reside in museum collections, studied not only for their historical data, but for what they reveal about the psychology of ancient rulers. The precision of the writing, the careful shaping of the clay into a multifaceted prism, and the deliberate choice of form all suggest a desire to impress, to craft something permanent. This was more than a tablet. Its 8 sides created a sense of completeness, as if no angle of Tiglath-Pileser's rule could be left unrecorded. When one looks at it today, in the quiet halls of a museum, it is easy to imagine the scribes pressing each wedge into wet clay, carefully recording the words dictated by the king. The sound of stylus against clay, the weight of royal presence, and the belief that these words would endure, it all lingers in the object itself. And indeed, those words did endure. Long after Tiglath-Pileser's empire crumbled, long after Assur itself fell, the prism lay buried, waiting to be read again. For modern eyes, the 8-sided prism is more than a record of battles. It is a time capsule of power, belief, and human ambition. It speaks of a king who wanted to be remembered, and who ensured his deeds were immortalized in the most durable of materials. It connects us not only to his world, but to the enduring human desire to leave a mark, to write our story into the earth so it will never fade. And so, as we study this prism today, we hear the faint echo of Tiglath-Pileser's voice across nearly 3,000 years. Not the voice of his enemies, not the truth in its full complexity, but the carefully crafted self-image of a ruler who wanted the world to know and never forget that he was king. Persian king Mithridates, shaking hands with Greek god Heracles. There exists an artifact that almost feels like a story frozen in stone, a scene that blurs the boundary between history and myth. It shows a Persian king, Mithridates, standing before none other than the Greek hero Heracles, and the two are captured in the simple but powerful act of shaking hands. At first glance, it might seem like a decorative carving, or just another piece of ancient propaganda, but the more you look at it, the stranger it becomes. How is it that a Persian ruler, belonging to one of the most influential empires of the East, is depicted in direct interaction with one of the greatest legendary figures of Greece? Was this simply an artistic choice, or was it meant to convey something much deeper? Mithridates is a name carried by several rulers across centuries, but in this instance we are speaking of Mithridates I of Parthia. He was a king who reigned during the 2nd century BCE, expanding his kingdom into a true empire. His reign marked the rise of Parthia as a power strong enough to rival Rome. At the same time, Heracles, known to the Greeks as the son of Zeus, famed for his 12 labors, was a mythological figure. For Greeks, he represented strength, heroism, and divine endurance. Yet here, in a striking visual, a real king and a legendary god stand side by side, their hands clasped as if agreeing to a pact. This imagery did not exist in isolation. The Parthians were positioned at the crossroads of many cultures. They inherited influences from Persia, Greece, and even further west and east. After Alexander the Great swept through the region, the Hellenistic world left its mark on art, politics, and symbolism. To show Mithridates alongside Heracles was more than an artistic flourish. It was a calculated statement. It tied the authority of the king not only to Persian traditions but also to Greek heroic ideals. It suggested that Mithridates was not merely a ruler but a figure of almost mythic strength, worthy of comparison to Heracles himself. The handshake itself is important. Across cultures, this simple gesture represents unity, trust, or a formal agreement. In ancient depictions, a handshake could symbolize divine approval of a ruler or an alliance between two powerful figures. In this case, one is human and the other divine. Was the scene meant to suggest that Mithridates had secured the favor of Heracles, the embodiment of strength and courage, or was it intended to present the king as the living reflection of a godlike hero? The Parthians were skilled at adapting imagery to serve political purposes. They understood that their empire stretched across diverse peoples with varied traditions. To the Persians, Mithridates could be seen as the inheritor of Achaemenid grandeur. To the Greeks within his territories, this image tied him to a cultural icon they understood and admired. By shaking hands with Heracles, Mithridates became a universal figure, one who spoke across traditions. This was more than propaganda, it was a unifying symbol that helped bind together the identity of his empire. But while the image has meaning, questions remain. Was there a religious undertone here, or was it purely symbolic? Heracles was not typically worshipped in the Persian world, but after Alexander's campaigns, he became a familiar figure even in Eastern lands. Could Mithridates have encouraged the blending of beliefs, or was this image simply a way to communicate his strength to Greek subjects under his rule? We may never know the exact motivation, but what we do know is that this handshake echoes across centuries as one of the clearest examples of how myth and history intertwine. Archaeologists who have studied the artifact note its remarkable craftsmanship. The figures are rendered with a precision that leaves little doubt about who they are meant to represent. Mithridates wears the attire of a ruler, firm and commanding, while Heracles is identifiable by his lion skin and muscular build, the symbols that always accompany him in Greek art. There is no ambiguity in their meeting, it is intentional and unmistakable. This artifact also raises questions about how ancient peoples viewed their heroes and leaders. Did subjects of Mithridates see him as a man elevated to the status of Heracles? Was he portrayed in this way to suggest that kingship itself carried divine sanction? Or was it more subtle, reminding his people that just as Heracles endured impossible labors, so too did their king shoulder the burdens of empire? The Parthian Empire, though often overshadowed in history by the Greeks and Romans, was a formidable force in its time. It controlled key trade routes and stood as a counterbalance to Rome's expansion. For a king like Mithridates, projecting strength was essential. An image of alliance with Heracles would have communicated to friend and foe alike that this was a ruler of extraordinary stature. Yet even beyond politics, there is a strange timelessness in the image. To see a mortal ruler clasp hands with a mythological hero is to be reminded of how thin the boundary between myth and reality once was. For the people of that era, these were not separate worlds but overlapping layers of meaning. Gods and heroes shaped the way they understood history, and rulers were not just men, they were figures who embodied the divine, the heroic, and the eternal. Today, this handshake continues to spark fascination. It reflects the blending of cultures, the merging of East and West, and the ways rulers sought to project their authority through shared symbols. It also forces us to ask, how often have myths been used to shape real history? How many rulers aligned themselves with legendary figures to create a legacy that reached beyond their mortal lives? The artifact of Mithridates and Heracles reminds us that in the ancient world, the line between a king and a god was often blurred. In this frozen moment, captured in stone, we see more than a greeting, we see a declaration of strength, unity, and the desire to stand alongside the eternal heroes of legend. And while Mithridates lived and died as a man, the image of his handshake with Heracles allowed his legacy to step into the realm of myth, where time has no hold. Lioness devouring a man. Phoenician ivory panel, c. 9th–8th century BCE. Among the fragments of ancient artistry that survive from the ruins of empires, some stand out not because of their beauty or their elegance, but because of the raw power they hold. Their ability to disturb, to unsettle, and to remind us of the brutal worlds our ancestors inhabited. One such piece is a Phoenician ivory panel, carved nearly 3,000 years ago, showing a lioness in the act of devouring a man. It was unearthed in the ruins of Nimrud, the once great city of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, in northern Mesopotamia, Iraq. At first glance, the panel is deceptively small, only a fragment of what was once a larger decoration, probably adorning furniture or perhaps a royal throne. Yet the image it carries is unforgettable. A lioness, muscles tensed, jaws tearing into the flesh of a man. The figure of the human is limp, almost helpless, as though life has already left his body. The artistry is precise, delicate, but unflinching. This is not an abstract symbol, it is a direct portrayal of violence, of domination, of the natural world's merciless side. Why would such an image be chosen to decorate a royal palace? Why would the Phoenician craftsman who carved with such skill present such a scene of terror? To understand this, we have to step into the mindset of the Assyrians and the world they built. The Phoenicians, masters of ivory carving, were often commissioned by foreign rulers. Their works traveled across the Mediterranean and Near East, adorning the palaces of kings who sought not only luxury but symbolism. For the Assyrians, the lion was more than an animal, it was the very embodiment of power, ferocity, and kingship. The lion hunt, in particular, was a favored subject in Assyrian art. Kings were often shown battling lions, their victory over the beast serving as proof of their ability to conquer chaos and maintain order. But this panel is different. It shows not a king triumphing, but a lioness prevailing over man. The power dynamic is reversed. The human figure is prey, not master. What does this tell us? Perhaps it was meant as a reminder that without strength, without authority, even humans, lords of civilization, could fall. It may have been a symbol of the chaos that always lingered at the edges of empire, threatening to consume those who could not control it. The artistry of the panel is remarkable. Carved in ivory, a material itself associated with prestige and luxury, it shows the careful detail of Phoenician craftsmanship. The lioness is rendered with fluid lines, her body curving as she crouches over the human form. The man's limbs dangle with a strange softness, the contrast between predator and prey made stark. This was not random decoration, it was intentional, designed to provoke thought and emotion. Placed within the palace of Ashurnasirpal II, the image would have carried weight. Nimrud was not just a city, it was a statement of Assyrian dominance. The walls of its palaces were covered in reliefs depicting battles, conquests, and the submission of enemies. Every image was part of a narrative. The king is strong, the empire is unbreakable, order will always triumph. And yet, here we find a small panel showing man as victim. Was it a warning? Was it meant to remind the king himself that even rulers could fall prey if they lost their strength? Or was it meant for visitors, a chilling illustration of the consequences of weakness before the Assyrian throne? There is also another way to view this panel, as a mythological symbol. In many ancient cultures, lions and lionesses were connected to goddesses of war, protection, and vengeance. The act of a lioness devouring a man may not have been intended as literal at all, but as divine retribution, a goddess figure consuming an unworthy mortal. The Phoenicians, steeped in their own traditions of symbolism, may have infused this imagery with layers of meaning that resonated differently in different contexts. The discovery of this panel in Nimrud reminds us of the cosmopolitan nature of ancient empires. Objects did not belong to one culture alone. Phoenician artisans carved it, Assyrian kings displayed it, and its meaning likely shifted depending on who looked at it. To a craftsman, it was a demonstration of skill, To a courtier, it was a reminder of power. To a king, perhaps it was both a warning and a reassurance. Power must be maintained, for the moment you falter, chaos will consume you. As we look at it today, preserved in fragments, we can still feel its unsettling presence. The choice to depict such an intimate moment of violence suggests that ancient rulers did not shy away from confronting the harsh realities of life and death. They embraced these images, wove them into the very fabric of their palaces, and lived surrounded by reminders of the eternal struggle between man and beast, order and chaos, life and death. What makes the piece even more haunting is its survival. Thousands of years have passed since Nimrud fell. The palace of Ashurnai-Serpal II, once filled with splendor, was reduced to ruins. And yet this fragment, this ivory carving of a lioness and her prey, endured. It carries with it not only the story of the man in the image, but the story of empires, of cultural exchange, and of humanity's fascination with its own fragility. To hold this panel, or even to see it behind glass today, is to feel a strange weight. It is art, but it is also warning. It is beauty, but it is also horror. It is a reminder that ancient art was never simply decoration. It was power, it was meaning, it was memory, carved into material meant to outlast the ages. And in this panel, we hear the roar of the lioness echoing from centuries ago. A sound that is both triumph and terror. A reminder that beneath the grandeur of kings, beneath the pride of empires, the raw struggle of life and death was never far away. Elephanta Cave Temples, Mumbai, India, 5th century CE. Just across the waters from the bustling city of Mumbai lies a small island that holds a secret carved in stone. Known as Elephanta Island, it shelters a series of cave temples that date back to the 5th century CE. For visitors today, the contrast is striking. After leaving behind the endless noise of one of the world's busiest cities, the soundscape changes. The horns and engines fade, replaced by the calls of seabirds and the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore. And then, as you climb the steps and pass through the entrance, you find yourself face to face with an ancient world preserved in rock. The Elephanta Caves are dedicated primarily to the god Shiva. These rock-cut temples are not simple shrines, but grand halls carved directly into the basalt rock of the island. Imagine the scale of the task. Entire chambers, colonnades, and sculptural panels had to be hewn by hand, with tools that seem primitive compared to modern machinery. Yet what survives is far from rough or unrefined. The sculptures are detailed, expressive, and monumental. The most famous of these is the great three-headed image of Shiva, known as the Trimurti. It is a colossal relief sculpture, standing more than 20 feet tall. The central face is calm and meditative, representing Shiva as the preserver. To the right, one face appears fierce and powerful, embodying Shiva as the destroyer. To the left, another face seems serene, symbolizing creation. Together, the three faces capture the cosmic cycle: creation, preservation, and destruction, etched into stone in a way that still commands awe after 1,500 years. Walking through these caves, you notice that every wall and pillar carries some story. Panels show Shiva in different forms, as the cosmic dancer, as the ascetic meditating in the Himalayas, and as the family man alongside his consort Parvati. Each carving is a reminder that this was not just a place of worship, but also a place of storytelling. People who may not have been able to read texts could still see the stories of gods and the universe brought to life through these immense carvings. Archaeologists and historians still debate who exactly commissioned these caves. Some believe they were built by the rulers of the Kalachuri dynasty, others point to early Chalukyan kings. What is certain is that it would have required enormous resources, skilled artisans, laborers, and planners all working in careful coordination. The caves were not completed overnight. They took years, perhaps decades, to finish. Another puzzle is how these artisans managed such precision with such limited tools. There is no evidence of advanced machinery here. The work would have been carried out using hammers, chisels, and careful measurement. The sheer scale of the Trimurti alone makes you wonder how they balanced the proportions, carved the details, and avoided mistakes that could have ruined the entire composition. Over the centuries, the Elephanta Caves faced damage and neglect. When the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century, they reportedly used the caves for target practice, leaving behind marks and broken sculptures that can still be seen. Time, too, took its toll. Weathering and human neglect eroded some of the fine details. And yet, despite all of this, the essence of the caves survives. When you stand inside, you feel surrounded not only by stone but by the weight of history and devotion. The name Elephanta itself came from the Portuguese, who found a large stone sculpture of an elephant near the island's shore. That elephant, now relocated, gave the island its modern name, but the people who originally carved these caves likely knew the place by another name, one lost to time, just like the voices of those who once prayed within its walls. Today, Elephanta is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved as much as possible for future generations. Visitors take the ferry across the harbor, climb the long stairway up the hill, and enter a space that seems frozen between the human and the divine. For those who wander there, it is both a physical and spiritual journey, a reminder of how human hands shaped stone into something meant to last far beyond a single lifetime. The mystery of Elephanta is not about hidden treasures or unsolved codes. It lies in the endurance of belief, in how ideas were carved so deeply into rock that even time, invaders, and erosion could not erase them. The caves still whisper of devotion, art, and the endless cycles of creation, destruction, and preservation that the Trimurti silently portrays.